301. Chapter 301. Still, after actually verifying that he had in fact been dropped off by Dumbledore, she was more than happy to take his business. Nazgul was also fawned over by the older witch, who simply couldn't get over how cute she was. This was nothing new for the spoiled creature, as she got similar attention from the females in the school as well. Colin Creevy had made a small fortune after taking a photo of her, and then getting several dozen moving copies made that he sold at 6 nuts a pop. Once Nick felt he had done everything he wanted to in Hogsmeade, he pulled out his broom from his ring realm before flying rapidly and freely into the sky. He, of course, disillusioned himself, since he didn't want to deal with the questions about why he got out of a day's worth of classes without any of the teachers saying anything. Still, that didn't mean he didn't enjoy the short flight over to the castle before landing in the courtyard stealthily. Carefully creeping into the castle, Nick made his way over to the workshop, since he still needed to avoid people for the rest of the day until dinner in 4 hours. The room was empty like it should have been, after he made it clear that entering without permission was grounds for punishment previously. Sitting down in one of the chairs, he let Nazgul out of the ring realm and brought out his 2 reward tickets from it as well. First, he spun the item roulette to see what he got, and was pleasantly surprised to find out that he got the astral anvil. With this, as well as the hammer, he could now complete each enchantment much more efficiently, since the anvil would reverberate the energy he channeled per strike back into the ring getting worked. He replaced his old anvil with the new one without hesitation before moving on to the crafting style ticket that made him a bit nervous. The first style he got was the mainstay of his entire enchantment process, and he had only barely mastered 80% of it to date, so if he got another that was just as complex, he would greatly struggle to master both. The wheel that was summoned from the system after he chose to use the ticket was a bright rainbow color and shrouded in dense mist, much like it was previously. Soon the wheel began to spin rapidly before slowing down and landing on a glowing white option, and the congratulations notification from the system rang through his head. Congratulations on receiving the crafting style, Twilight. Nick read the name of the style, but was confused since he had no clue what it was about. Like when he got his first style, the roulette wheel burst apart, and the fog in the room all gush up his nose and into his mind. Nick closed his eyes to sort through the information that he had just received and couldn't help but frown a little. Compared to the Celebrimber style, this one was far simpler and also less versatile as well. The way this style worked was that the crafter collected light, not really light though, from the sun, moon and stars before congealing it into a shape and function based on what the light was drawn from. Unlike the Celebrimber style that was limited only by knowledge and personal energy stores, this style could only ever utilize the light of a finite amount of stuff. While there are a lot of stars to be used, it does still have a defined limit. Even more irritating was that Nick would have no idea what properties the light would have until after he spent the time to collect some of it. This wasn't a short process either, as it required him to attune his spirit to the specific light he was after, then force it from the air into solid form, which required serious effort. The easiest part of this style was the actual crafting, as all he needed to do was force the light he collected together with the given method, and it did the rest on its own. There was an upside to this style of crafting, however, that was great. It allowed him to create objects far beyond his regular level of power. So long as he collected enough light, he could theoretically congeal a legendary grade object on his first attempt. He wouldn't attempt it, however, since unlike with the Celebrimber style, this inheritance was lacking in a whole hell of a lot of details. Most likely the person who made it only wanted the inheritor to know the absolute basics, so they needed to experiment with it to learn the advanced stuff. Nick thought in irritation. 302. Chapter 302. Nick might be irritated at the creator's choice in this regard, but he also understood why they did it as well. See, crafting is an art, and much like painting or sculpting, each crafter went about the process in a different way depending on how they learned the craft. By giving only the barest minimum in basic information, the creator of this inheritance forced Nick to truly make the style his own, as he needed to do everything using his own methods. For example, it was probably possible to mix different lights together, but Nick needed to figure out how on his own, and whatever he came up with may be totally different than the method the Inheritance's creator used. To put it bluntly, Nick had the foundation for this crafting style, but whatever he built on top of that would be his own work exclusively. Well, at least it shouldn't take me very long to master this new style, he thought with a shrug. That reminds me for whatever reason, but does this mean you might be getting a new roommate in my head? Nick asked the old elf, currently taking up residence in his mindscape. That depends on the creator of this new style of crafting. If they are willing, then their being will be pulled in by the system. Otherwise, you will not be gaining another tutor at all. Judging from the inheritance, however, I very much doubt that this person will agree to guide you, Celebrimber said seriously. Oh, does that mean you agreed to teach me when I drew your own inheritance? Nick asked, interested in the answer. The old elf had a sad smile. After I died, my legacy was forever tainted by the foul hidden plot of Sauron, and I had hoped that by guiding someone with my inheritance I could redeem it somehow. You have so far proven my decision correct, he said honestly. Nick chuckled at that answer, since he was very aware that he was by no means perfect and had plenty of flaws. Compared to what Sauron used the style to accomplish, though he was certainly redeeming it as a grand crafting style, and not an evil thing. Hell, his most recent accomplishment was using the style to forge a miniature realm of all things, an untainted one no less. Nick dismissed his ego-inflating thoughts, though, and focused on a new plan. He wanted to create his first ring with this new style, and so needed to first collect light. The method to collect light was a sort of wandless silent magic involving hand sense. He first needed to extend his senses until he felt the light before slowly and very precisely weaving the correct hand signs to draw it into the material plane and harness it. This created the ore that he needed to forge his creations. With this in mind, Nick wasted no time at all leaving the workshop for the astronomy tower that was empty at this time of day. The basic information of the inheritance stated that the sun and moon were the easiest sources of light to harvest from due to their close proximity and ever-present nature. Thus, Nick's first attempt at harvesting light will be with the most abundant source of it, the sun. No one even noticed Nick as he walked the halls, since students moving about at this time was totally normal and not worth mentioning. The astronomy tower was in fact empty, just like he had expected, so he reached the exposed top of it easily. Once there, he felt the heat of the sun touching his face and closed his eyes to extend his senses in the way that his new style dictated. It was a strange feeling, as it felt almost like the world around him faded away like a blurry image, while a certain something started to stand out in the image that was always there, but not at the forefront. Nick focused on this thing, and slowly and awkwardly began to move his hands in the way that the style dictated to drag the light into the material plane. He felt his magic flow into his hands on its own as he performed these hand signs and extend from his fingertips like strange threads that felt odd to him, but he couldn't say exactly why. The threads crept through the air and wrapped around the light loosely before retracting as he cycled through the different hand signs. He was rapidly losing mana as they did so, since the light seemed very resistant to his actions, and in the end, he only managed to retrieve a pebble's worth of the stuff before exhausting the majority of his mana. 303. Chapter 303. Nick opened his eyes after he felt the light touch his palm and examined its appearance closely. It was an orange-red color with a strangely heavy feel to it, like it was made of tungsten. Despite that, however, Nick could easily deform the material with the strength of his fingers alone, showing how soft it was. After he was done examining the material, he placed it within the ring realm to try and analyze it on a much deeper level, and was surprised by what he found. He could feel a certain desire from the realm for the stuff, as if it was a piece of it that it had been missing until now. It wasn't hard to figure out why, either as the ring realm didn't have a sun or any stars, but was in a state of perpetual twilight as the light within it bounced around without settling. The material taken from the sun's light, however, was basically condensed essence of the sun, which the realm wanted to complete and perfect itself further. The problem came in the form of amoutage, however, as Nick could also tell that he required a lot of the material to satisfy his realm even at its current size, much less later. Despite instinctively wanting to perfect his realm, Nick chose to ignore that craving, since it was a waste of time to focus on doing so at the moment. Instead, he focused on understanding everything he could about this new material to see what all the possible applications of it may be. The stuff has a very high mana conductivity, but also an equally high mana dispersion rate, which makes it a poor choice for long-term enchantment, but excellent for short-term magical applications, such as rituals or alchemy. He thought seriously. It seems to inherently possess anti-curse, as well as purification power, that would also make it ideal for a defensive item, though I would need to discover a method of hardening it for such a thing. He theorized as he got more and more information from his realm. While the style said that it was impossible to tell what abilities the light would have until it was utilized, it was obvious to Nick that the creator of the inheritance had not thought about someone with a personal realm gaining the inheritance. To be fair, though, a personal realm was an extremely rare thing to have for someone as weak as he was, so that is to be expected. At least I won't have to waste much time on lights that I don't want and can simply feed those to the realm instead. He thought as he left the astronomy tower. Pulling out his wand, he spoke Tempus, and the current time entered his mind 5:45. I should start heading towards the Great Hall for dinner, he thought with a nod. It only took him about 5 minutes to arrive at his destination and seat himself at the table. He was slightly early, so there weren't many people in the Great Hall at the moment, so he played around a bit with Nazgul and Steve as he waited for dinner to start. It was a simple game, really, as they needed to each chase down a small marble of light he summoned and controlled. In Steve's case, the marble rolled on the floor, while for Nazgul it zipped about in the air. Most of the students watched the two magical beasts playing happily in interest, since it was a rare sight. The professors started to arrive early and noticed the activity, and most smiled warmly at the cheerful mood it provided, while others, such as Snape, chose to ignore it. None of the teachers whose class Nick missed today said anything to him about it, since Dumbledore had already given them a vague excuse for it, which was enough. The only one that was truly aware of where Nick had been was Snape, due to him being the triple agent working for Dumbledore and Voldemort. It was a complex sort of relationship, as he fed information to Voldemort while also doing the same to Dumbledore, but he was actually working for Dumbledore. Still, once the students started to arrive, en masse, Nick dispelled the marbles and brought the two creatures back under control. Poor Steve, though, was so out of shape that he was panting and looked dreadful from the workout. He did it to himself with all that food and no exercise, Nick thought, while administering a small amount of workout potion to help the chunky Niffler recover a bit. As an added bonus, Steve also lost a tiny amount of fat as well, so that was a plus if nothing else. 304. Chapter 304. Voldemort Parv. Things had not been going my way ever since that night so long ago, when I tried to subvert that damned prophecy by killing its candidate. The parents were easy to dispatch, since my arrival had caught them off guard. The father had lacked his wand entirely, but resorted to physical means to try and fend me off, an admirable display of courage, but ultimately futile. And the mother, a curse upon her soul, shielded her child, her own body, and every once of her magic responded. I was so caught up in my inevitable victory that I didn't even notice the ancient magic activating. I cast the killing curse on the child and fell into the trap. Pain racked my very soul, and my body shriveled and decayed as my immortality fought against the magical death that would have been apportioned me without it. I barely managed to hide away my wand in the room before my body was destroyed, and I was reduced to a pitiful and pathetic wraith-like state. I fled to the forests of Albania for nearly 10 whole years, building my strength from the vermin and wretched creatures there, until Quirrell found me. He willingly allowed me to reside within his body in exchange for knowledge on how to grow more powerful, an acceptable price to pay in order to steal the Philosopher's Stone and recreate a body truly suitable for me to reside in. You might be able to imagine my anger to learn that the child prophesied to strike me down was barely above average in academics. Me, an archmage laid low by an average individual. The boy's friend, however, was very much a different story, as he was so talented that I was slightly envious. creating his own enchantment method before even getting into the school, mastering spells with little effort, and an innate talent in transfiguration on the same level as a metamorphagus. Sadly, I never got the option to dispose of or persuade the boy, as he avoided me surprisingly easily. That was before that old fool revealed the boy's heritage to the world, and I knew without any doubt that the child needed to be dealt with the moment I got a new body. The last no descendant of Rowena Ravenclaw, and by extension the lord of the house. As a descendant of Slytherin myself, I of all people knew the power that such a bloodline granted. In the hands of a talented and clearly ambitious person like the boy, who was willing to work hard to excavate his full potential, reaching my level was almost a guarantee, and I simply couldn't allow that. Alas, things went horribly awry when the Potter boy confronted me while I was trying to figure out how to retrieve the stone from that blasted mirror. During that confrontation, I felt the defenses I placed around the diadem get triggered and knew that I had been manipulated. The Ravenclaw brat had not gotten anywhere near the diadem, whilst I was disguised as Quirrell, so I had assumed incorrectly that the Grey Lady hadn't informed him of the artifact housing a piece of my soul. In truth, the brat had lulled me into a false sense of security before making his move, whilst I was busy dealing with the Potter boy. In my moment of distraction, the Potter child shattered the stone, ruining any chance of using its power for my own resurrection. When I went to strangle the child in my rage, I discovered that the boy's mother had placed protective magic on him that made it impossible for me to touch a hair on his head. Quirrell's body, which was on the brink of collapse, hit the final straw at that moment, and finally fell apart, forcing me back into that wretched wraith-like state. I could only once again flee to the Albanian forests to bide my time, while the Ravenclaw brat, no doubt, rapidly accumulated power. Fortune finally smiled upon me, however, when a strange individual arrived in the forests and swore themselves to me for vengeance against something that brat had done. It was less than ideal, but I agreed to the creation of a ritual to create a rudimentary body for myself, until I could perform another to gain a perfect vessel for my massive magic. It was rather ironic how, while the failure of a Dark Lord Grindelwald was conducting sacrifices himself, for some reason I was using that to collect the sacrifices for my return. We held the ritual, and I finally had a body of my own, and immediately sought to learn all that had happened in my absence. It displeased me greatly to learn that Black had been released and Pettigrew executed. But it was only over the next few days that I felt rage burn inside me as I checked the hiding place of each of my Horcruxes, only to find them gone, taken. 305. Chapter 305. Nick ate dinner without any issue at all and turned in for the night quite satisfied with what he had accomplished for the day. He was completely unaware that Voldemort was practically screaming for his blood at the moment after learning that his Horcruxes were missing. Voldemort was also horribly worried about his most recent Horcrux, however, as it was his last lifeline to immortality as far as he was aware. As a result, he layered an unreasonable amount of protections on Nagini to stop any attack on her. Unlike the other Horcruxes that could be hidden away safely, Nagini was a living thing, and as such required food and water regularly to survive. As a result, he brought her everywhere with him now so that nothing untoward happened. If Nick knew about this, he wouldn't care to begin with, as compared to Voldemort his upcoming problems were far more important. As far as he was concerned, he had already removed all the irritating Horcruxes to deal with, leaving only the two simpler ones to deal with. Harry's soul shard was proving trickier than anticipated for Nick, as he had brought Harry into the realm to study it while he was showing off earlier, and fully analyzed the connection between the shard and Harry. To put it bluntly, Harry's soul was firmly wrapped around the shard, and needed one of two things to occur for it to be removed. The first was for Harry himself to gain control over his soul and fully devour the shard, removing its connection to Voldemort, while also boosting his own talent and abilities. That was the best option in Nick's opinion, and had only upsides with no downsides. The second method, however, was much worse. Harry needed to die. To be more specific, his soul needed to be fully removed from his body, allowing it to expand as bodiless souls do, releasing the shard that without a vessel would disperse. The problem with this method was that Nick would then need to expend the decade-long ability of the staff of Asclepius to resurrect Harry after the soul shard was gone. The method Dumbledore used in the books also worked, but required so much coincidences to play out that it was better to not use it at all. Nick obviously wanted to take the first method in a manner of speaking. So he wasn't going to train Harry how to control his soul, but rather was going to give Harry the resurrection stone ring and secretly have Harry come into contact with the stone in his soul space and devour it. This way, Harry didn't need to learn a dangerous thing like soul magic and could still get the benefits. Now I need to figure out how to do this without anyone figuring it out, he thought to himself as he slowly drew in more light from the sun the next day. It wasn't hard to improve at this new magic, since with only the bare minimum information, it only took a few small adjustments to see improvement. It was a bit like learning how to swim by experience, as he flailed about at first, but when he found something that worked, he immediately shifted to it and slowly got better and better at it. The biggest problem Nick had with this new light-drawing magic was that it left him horribly vulnerable, as all of his senses were muffled as he focused on the lights. This meant if anyone were to sneak up on him or attack him, he may not realize it until it's too late. He was working on sensing the lights without dampening his other senses, but it was without any progress at the moment. He was very tempted to use his first enchantment method to create a ring to passively stat the light-sensing magic onto his other senses, but he had this sneaking suspicion that that may cause him serious problems later. Still, adjusting his light-collecting magic was far easier, so he now had a basketball-sized mass of the sun's light material ready to use. Interestingly, unlike metal ore that remained separate from other pieces of the same stuff, the light instead fused with other pieces nearby. Nick stood in his realm, holding the light material in his hands, as he began the condensation process of the crafting style under the analysis of the realm. He made various hand signs that caused his magic to wrap around the material and begin to stab into and fuse with it. Once enough magic had been injected, the material violently shuddered and began to fold into itself while taking a specific form that it was most attuned to. To Nick's irritation, that form was not a ring of some sort like he had thought, but rather was an arrow with a round golden head and white flame-like feather fletching. 306, Chapter 306. It was about 2 feet long altogether, but weighed practically nothing at all in his hands. Ah, this is going to be one of those annoying things where I need to figure out how to shape the final product into a ring, isn't it? Nick thought with a groan. After carefully checking the analysis of the process, he was slightly relieved to notice that the final shape could be manually changed after it started. Nick checked the appraisal for the arrow that the system gave and was rather surprised at what he found. Arrow, Soul Shark Grade, Rare Abilities, Light Construct, Evil Purification, Sun Fire Burst Description. An arrow crafted using a strange and unorthodox magic that condensed the sun's light into solid form. This arrow is the bane of all evil beings and can eradicate even the immortal should it be evil. System Appraisal, a circumstantial weapon that is either very powerful or very weak, depending on what it is used on. This thing can kill immortal creatures so long as they are evil. Did I just accidentally make a Dementor-slaying weapon? No, not just Dementors, but Lethofolds, and maybe even other creatures as well. Nick thought with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was happy that he could now work on getting rid of the foul things rather than contain them like the Ministry did. On the other hand, though, this arrow painted a huge target on his back for every evil creature in existence. Ironically, though, this arrow also made Voldemort stupidly easy to get rid of now, as the man definitely counted as an evil creature. And if this arrow can kill things that don't even have souls like Dementors, then Horcrux or not, he would also die after getting hit with it. Nice. Now I don't even need to worry about Harry dealing with the soul shard. Instead, I just need him to stab the noseless bastard with this thing to fulfill the prophecy. Nick thought with a smirk. Nick wasn't satisfied with only having a single one of these arrows, however, since there were hundreds of evil immortal creatures that he wanted to get rid of, so he needed hundreds of arrows. This was how he spent all his free time for the next month when he wasn't in class or hanging out with his friends, who were very unhappy about being left out of the dangerous stuff he has been doing. They got over it pretty easily when he distracted them by giving Harry the gaunt ring with the resurrection stone in it. He, of course, didn't tell them what the stone was, but he did say that it was an artifact belonging to Harry's bloodline, which interested all of them. The only one who immediately figured out what it was Luna, but she kept quiet about it, likely because of how that knowledge had affected her father over the years. Poor Zeno had been consumed with the desire to see his wife again, and had fallen into the trap of searching for the Hallows all this time. Such a mindset was to be avoided at all cost in the girl's mind, and so she didn't expose the artifact's origin. Hermione being the bookworm, she was tried to find any and all information on Harry's bloodline, but was surprised to note that the trail ran cold at a certain point in the family tree. It was an unnatural stop, too, like all the information about that particular topic had been purposefully removed. Nick was fairly certain that that was Dumbledore's doing, as probably the one person in the castle with a reason to hide that particular piece of history. Still, by the end of the month, Nick had close to 400 soul-shot arrows. Thanks to his constant refining of the sun's light, he had improved the base technique so dramatically that the before and after techniques barely even resembled each other anymore. At this point, Nick could draw enough light to form 3 arrows per collection he did. As a result, he had been generous and started to sacrifice some of the light material to the realm, causing it to form a tiny marble-sized sun at its edge. It wasn't much, but it brightened up the realm by quite a bit as the ambient light increased several folds. After what was basically half a month of almost constant refining, Nick was feeling a bit worn out on the process and took a break to take on some commissions from students and staff members. It was funny how, after the events of last year, all he needed to do was have the twins pass out the information on him, taking limited commissions for Nick to get dozens of visitors in the same day. 307, Chapter 307. Literally everyone in the castle was aware that he could create fairly solid enchantments for all manner of things. The best example of this was the Playmaker rings that more than a few people were dying to get their hands on. To be fair, though, Malfoy still goes around making an ass of himself by bragging about his own ring that was all shiny and pretty to look at. Nick had to screen the people coming for commissions, as more than a few were clearly trying to rip him off. Like a first-year Slytherin student, actually thought that Nick was stupid enough not to realize why he wanted a solid gold ring with an enchantment to get away with sleeping in class for cheap. The student tried to argue that Nick shouldn't be charging for materials, at which point Nick kicked him out. Unless someone provided the material themselves, he was definitely going to charge for them, or else it comes out of his pocket. Despite the few troublemakers, he did get quite the eclectic and varied set of orders. From water breathing to flight, the list was extensive and made Nick's friends wonder why someone would even want some of them, like the person who wanted a ring that purred like a cat when stroked. That wasn't a joke, as a first-year Hufflepuff girl wanted exactly that for some reason. Nick split the commissions into 3 categories based on a few factors such as difficulty, material cost, research time, and how willing he was to do it. The categories basically just decided the order he did them in, with the easy and near effortless ones coming first, followed by the moderate difficulty and research involved ones, and finally the pains in the ass time sinks. After he had crafted his realm ring, Nick was surprised to find out that his soul had fully resonated with his body and mind, perfecting his channeling of spiritual energy. This meant that he no longer glowed when he enchanted something, though the glow from the rings and floating words during the process was still there. This was a huge boon to Nick, as it meant he could now crank out even more rings a day, since he wasn't wasting as much energy during each session. Meanwhile, his friends were each improving by leaps and bounds in each of their chosen fields with his help. Ron finally crafted his first wand that was functional, using a piece of unicorn hair that Nick let him have as his first core material. Ron bragged to literally everyone who would listen to him for a week after that. Nick, on the other hand, was still studying the staff in his realm, as he was constantly improving his veritology knowledge, thanks to what he was getting. See, the staff was made in a far more advanced version of the subject that used hard to deduce methods. The core of the staff was from an extinct creature as well that was worth studying by itself. Hermione and Daphne were both quickly becoming fluent in Elder Futhark, as they rarely made any mistakes anymore when they wrote out sentences. Harry and Luna showed the greatest improvement, however, as when they dueled now, the only advantage Harry had over Luna was his much larger mana pool. Nick still won whenever he dueled against them, but he worked up a sweat so long as he didn't use any vicious moves to end the matches early. Tracy, on the other hand, was stuck in what may as well be crafting limbo, as Nick told her to create something from scratch without copying something else. All decent craftsmen need to learn how to think of designs and patterns for what they make, which was a lot harder than one would think. Tracy wasn't the most imaginative person, so struggled to come up with something from the top of her head. Still, other than that, she had already memorized the list of metals Nick had given her, as well as their properties. While he worked on his list of commissions, Nick also published his study on the merfolk community living in the Black Lake. It didn't make too much of an impact on the wizarding community at large, but it was mentioned in a few small research newspapers and a tiny spot in the Daily Prophet. As promised, Dumbledore got a copy of it for himself, while the Hogwarts library also got a copy. Nick may seem carefree during this time, but he was watching for any sign of Voldemort making a move. He knew the man wouldn't be able to sit still for very long, and was bound to do something to advance his agenda. 308. Chapter 308. Nick was correct too, as Voldemort was indeed planning a big move from his current place of residence, the Riddle Manor. His new servant was less than optimal in terms of power and influence, but one of those could be easily fixed with his guidance. In fact, that was what he had been doing this entire time, conducting various dark rituals to enhance the average talent of the servant to an acceptable level. Foul things that granted great power at terrible cost, that had reduced the servant to something not human, much like himself. Go now and bring me everyone related to the boy's past. I refuse to believe that he merely appeared out of nowhere. The cold voice of the Dark Lord spoke from a lounge chair. The cloaked servant bowed and left while the Dark Lord stroked his pet Nagini with a stern expression. Voldemort had secretly investigated Nick in depth, without doing anything to draw attention to himself, but was concerned to learn that no one seemed to have any clue at all where the boy came from. The earliest piece of information that could be found was the boy walking out of an alley covered in serious injuries with amnesia. Upon investigating the alley in question, all Voldemort discovered was that there was an almost completely faded trace of magic that sadly collapsed when he tried to capture it. Unknown to him, however, his failure and investigation were noticed by a certain group that had been watching all traces of Nick's background for a certain reason. Should we tell the Elder of this development? A man hidden in a shadow asked a small glowing orb seriously. To normal ears, a hissing sound came from the orb in response. In truth, it was a female voice speaking in parcel tongue. No, we shall continue to observe the boy's activities and past locations for now. Should that person continue poking where they have no right, we will inform the Elder before making our next move. The voice spoke from the orb before the orb stopped glowing. I wonder what fortuitous event it was that you met here that has changed you so much, little nephew. The man muttered before doing as he had been told and watching the traces Nick had left behind. Fate shifted in the background as many things unfolded in the shadows of the world with but a single focal point. Meanwhile, Nick woke up on the 1st of December, slightly uncomfortable, as the cold had rapidly overtaken the school in the past week. Nazgul had grown larger over the past month, and was now the size of a large dog breed, such as a Tibetan Mastiff. As a result, she had gone from adorable to slightly intimidating as her muscles developed and grew alongside her. Unfortunately for Nick, this meant that he simply didn't have enough room on his current bed to accommodate her. Needless to say, she was not happy about it at all. Nick also couldn't take her with him into classes anymore, as she simply couldn't fit comfortably due to all the desks that were close together. Instead, she was allowed to wander the castle freely, which had developed in an odd manner, as she was best friends with a young unicorn from the forest now. It came as quite the shock to Nick, to say the least, when he sought her out, only to see her running around with the creature near Hagrid's hut. In an interesting development today was actually the first day that the new Dada teacher was introduced. Getting dressed, Nick left the dorm room casually and sighed in relief when he got into the common room as the roaring fireplace was spreading plenty of warmth. He let Nazgul out of the realm where she sleeps now and settled down on the chair nearest the fire as he pulled out the fourth-year textbook of spells to study them. He had already fully read the book before, but was making sure that he didn't miss anything important when he skimmed through it. He found one or two small things that were missing from his understanding, but otherwise he found that he was well set. That merely took him about 30 minutes since he was skimming through the book again, and so moved on to the topic of one of his commissions, flight. Contrary to how it may seem, there were in fact several different ways to fly as a wizard besides on a broom. The problem came in the form of how obscure the magic involved was, to the point that Nick had only found 2 tomes on it in the entire library, ancient section and all. 309, Chapter 309. Even worse was that one of those tomes was merely pure theory without any actual spells, while the other had a single half-finished piece of magic that was stupidly complex, as it involved both a ritual and a spell, and both were incomplete. It was fairly easy to guess how irritating it was for Nick to have to slowly piece together both of those via a lot of trial and error. The plus side, however, was that he had figured out how Voldemort and his Death Eaters flew without brooms. That black smoky stuff they turn into is a byproduct of twisting this exact piece of magic in a dark direction. Nick himself had no plan to ever use this magic, personally, since he was planning to undergo the Animagus transformation. He was almost 90% sure about what he would turn into thanks to the Patronum charm he had been practicing periodically. He finally summoned his corporeal patroness and was not surprised to find that it was none other than a celestial bird. It was huge, by the way, like 12 feet tall huge. Appearance-wise, it looked most like a phoenix with an extra set of wings directly below the first and long tail feathers. Animagi tended to transform into their patroness animal, so Nick felt he was likely no different in this regard. The biggest problem, once again, came in the form of the phenomena that accompanied the birth of a magical beast. Him turning into an elf had not gotten that phenomena, since he was not being born so much as elevated to a higher state. Unfortunately, arithmancy was proving horribly difficult to make progress in, and the phenomena he had experienced twice needed a high mastery of the field to call down. Shaking his head to clear away those thoughts, Nick went back to reading the theory tome on flight magic. While fairly complicated, the field of magic could be boiled down roughly into a group of 5 rules. The first was that the magic was almost always very draining on the mana reserves of the witch or wizard. The second rule was that the magic must always have a stabilization component, or the user will certainly go up, but at an uneven rate. The third rule was similar to the second, as it was that the magic must always contain a control component, so that the user could steer. The fourth rule was that the magic must always have a way to negate the effects of gravity, or else the cost goes up dramatically. The final rule was the magic of flying through space was different than that of the atmosphere. Some of these rules made Nick think that the person who wrote this tome had definitely had their own method to fly and had personally experienced these things. Wizards had tried to reach the moon several times according to the history books after all, and someone with flight magic had a good chance of succeeding if they were prepared enough. Nick didn't put away the tome even after Hermione walked down from the girls' dormitory, since he had no need to hide this topic from her. "Is there actually a spell that lets one fly without a broom?" she asked curiously after reading the title. Nick nodded. "From what I can tell based on this book, and one other, there is likely several. The annoying part is that the library doesn't have any of them, well, complete spells anyways," he said honestly. "Perhaps they are in the forbidden section," she suggested, but Nick shook his head. "I checked there already, there weren't," he said with a shrug. Hermione frowned at that answer. "I can't believe you broke into the forbidden section. It's forbidden for a reason, you know." She scolded him, and he scoffed. "Most of those books contain dangerous or illegal knowledge, and are accursed, which is why they are forbidden for all but those who get permission. I have no interest in dark magic, and those curses are child's play to get around, so I barely visit that section," he explained disdainfully. For being forbidden, that section was a huge disappointment to Nick, as all the information there was either on topics he didn't care about like the dark arts, or on highly advanced, but usually illegal topics like potion recipes like polyjuice. Hermione looked both relieved that he wasn't interested in the stuff in the forbidden section and worried about his clear disregard for the rules. She knew he broke at least 4 every single day, for a fact as she has seen him do it. But they were usually the rules that seemed pointless, like the no spells in the hallways rule. 310. Chapter 310. Despite these concerns, Hermione didn't voice them, since as far as she could tell, Nick tended to know what he was doing even if it was dangerous. Instead, she moved the conversation back to the magic of flight, since the topic certainly interested her. She lacked any talent with a broom, which was a shortcoming she loathed, but accepted as a fact. But if she learned how to fly without a broom, it simply wouldn't matter anymore. They chatted about the topic for a while as Nick showed her the progress he had made in finishing the incomplete magic. She gave him few insights that he hadn't thought of during the conversation that he didn't hesitate to add to the process. All in all, it was a fruitful conversation that lasted until Harry and Ron woke up and came down the stairs of the boys' dorm. "Why are you two always up so early? Do you just not like sleep or something?" Ron asked with a yawn. "That's not even right. I go to bed before all of you most of the time, so I'm not missing any sleep at all, thank you very much," Nick said defensively. They all chuckled at that, but didn't argue since he wasn't lying, as he tended to go straight to bed after dinner, whereas they stay up an extra hour or two. After that, they all headed to the great hall for breakfast, while Nick kept complaining about the cold. Wasn't alone in his complaints either, as the Patel twins also disapproved of the temperature. Nick wasted no time at all casting a warming spell on himself and his friends, while also generously using it on the twins as well. It took a minute for the hall to fill with hungry students, but once it was Dumbledore stood up. "Good morning, everyone. If I could have your attention, I have several important announcements to make." His voice filled the hall, and all the students stared at the man curiously. "I am pleased to introduce your new defense against the dark arts professor, Remus Lupin," he said, and pointed his hand at a man with a claw-scarred face and pale skin that sat under light brown hair. Lupin stood up and bowed slightly at the applause that he got from the students, while Snape looked like he had been fed a whole sack of lemons before someone killed his favorite cat. "Yeah, I'm not going to get involved in that inevitable clash if I can help it," Nick thought seriously. In truth, he thought Snape would have been an excellent Dada professor, since the man was very well practiced in the dark arts. But with Voldemort's return, Nick knew that Dumbledore likely thought it was best to leave him as potions, which gave him plenty of free time. It wasn't all good news for Lupin to take office so suddenly, however, as Nick had not researched lycanthropy at all, and thus couldn't make a ring to counter it yet. This meant that the man would be a danger to everyone until Nick managed to fix that problem. I am also pleased to say that starting after this coming Christmas break, Hogwarts will be offering extra electives involving the crafting arts for those who are interested. The Great Hall fell into uproar at this announcement, and many students shot hopeful glances at Nick, likely thinking he was going to be the teacher for one of those. Nick smirked at these people because he knew for a fact that Dumbledore wouldn't do that without informing him first. The final announcement is that as of now, the dueling club is being reinstated under the dual teaching of Professors Lupin and Flitwick. Please apply with your heads of house if you are interested. For now, though, eat and have a wondrous day," Dumbledore said while clapping his hands, which caused the tables to fill with food. "What a clever move by the old man," Nick said with an approving smile. "What you're talking about? That crafting thing?" Ron asked, confused. "No, rather the dueling club instead," Nick said with a shake of his head. "Remember how things have recently gotten much more dangerous after Harry warned us. Dumbledore probably wants to use this dueling club to help us students better protect ourselves when we leave Hogwarts," Nick explained, and all his friends at the table had wide eyes as they figured out what he meant. This dueling club was only announced after Voldemort had returned, which was likely not a coincidence at all. More likely than not, both Lupin's instatement and this dueling club were both done in a hurry to better prepare the students for the inevitable hardships ahead. 311. Chapter 311. Nick's suspicion was proven true when McGonagall herself came to him in the workshop as his friends were discussing the announcements. Today was a Saturday, so the entire faculty was free at the moment, which meant the old man had his pick of messenger. "Mr. Ravenclaw, the headmaster would like to speak to you in his office. If you would please follow me, we can see this matter handled with utmost haste." The stern witch spoke after the door of the workshop was open after she knocked. "Is he in trouble?" Harry asked with a concerned expression. "Not at all, Mr. Potter. If anything, this could be considered a boon for Mr. Ravenclaw, though I am not at liberty to discuss why," the elderly witch said calmly. Nick stood up from his chair, and dusk landed on his shoulder, while Nazgul stood next to him eyeing the older witch intelligently. McGonagall shifted in place in discomfort, which tipped Nick off that she had been let in on his familiar's soul-eating ability. "You know her, Professor. Just because of what she can do does not mean she is any different," he said, and the professor looked surprised for a moment before sighing. "You are correct, Mr. Ravenclaw. Thank you for reminding me, since I had forgotten," she said gratefully. Nick waved it off, think nothing of it. "Now we'd best be on our way, as I have a suspicion as to the purpose of this meeting, but we'll reserve that thought until I get denial or confirmation on the matter," he said, and she nodded before leading him away. They didn't talk the entire trip to the headmaster's office. In fact, the only words the professor spoke was the password to the gargoyle, cockroach clusters. The gargoyle moved aside, and unlike normal, McGonagall went into the office as well, where Nick, in fact, found almost all of his teachers. Snape, McGonagall, Flitwick, and even Sprout were all waiting inside with the headmaster and the newest Professor Lupin. Nick saw the line-up and grew serious, so I was right, and this is about the danger bound to come soon, he said calmly. "I had assumed you might be able to predict the purpose to this meeting after the announcements at breakfast," Dumbledore said with a small smile. Nick looked at Lupin and examined him with his magical senses before raising an eyebrow. "So that's the source of lycanthropy. The person behind it made a few flawed assumptions during that attempt," he said, causing Lupin and the rest to all have shocked expressions. "What have you found?" Dumbledore asked curiously. "I won't sugarcoat it, since none of you are daft or balmy. The source of lycanthropy is a flawed attempt by someone to complete the animagus ritual process, but modified to make to end result a magical beast instead of a normal one. They made several crucial mistakes, however, that caused the curse to be born instead," Nick explained disdainfully. "How did you come to this conclusion exactly?" McGonagall asked, clearly finding his answer probable if not accurate. She herself was an animagi as well as master of transfiguration, so she knew that if a few changes were made to the ritual, contagion, such as the way werewolves are created, is very much doable. The first piece of evidence is the fact that an animagi can't be infected with lycanthropy, which should only be the case if two types of the same magic clash, with the more perfect magic coming out on top. The second piece of evidence is the fact that the lycanthropy transformation is tied to the full moon, while the animagus ritual is tied to the new moon. Finally, is because I myself happen to know exactly what the reason wizards and witches fail to become magical beasts during the ritual is, and how the ritual should be modified to allow it," Nick said calmly, and everyone in the room looks at the resident expert on the subject for confirmation that she gives in the form of a solemn nod. "If it's nothing too secretive, could you explain what that reason is?" Dumbledore asked, with a knowledge-eager expression. None of the professors other than Lupin doubted Nick's words, since he had shown repeatedly that he does not boast about things he wasn't sure of. "It's not that secretive, since anyone who has personally witnessed the birth of a magical creature was exposed to it, though unknowingly. See, I am rather sensitive to the changes in magic near me, as most of you should have noticed by now," Nick said, and they all nodded. "Thanks to that sensitivity, I discovered that at the precise moment of birth, a magical phenomena takes place, like the world itself, marking the creature as magical and therefore different from normal beasts. Witches and wizards lack this phenomena, and as such can only turn into non-magical creatures," he explained, leaving all of them enlightened as they finally understood the problem. 312. Chapter 312. If this is true, then why is there no records of such a phenomena? Snape asked critically. Nick knew that the man was merely being thorough in his understanding of the information, and as such was unbothered by the man's tone. For the same reason that no one here knows how to perform any of the grand works of magic that Merlin or the founders performed. Time. As it flows ever forward, time sinks information below its currents to either be rediscovered later or lost forever. The fact is that most powerful wizards have a great deal of secrets involving their powers, and once they die, those secrets are lost until rediscovered by another. As this process happens over and over again, due to the selfishness of the powerful wizards, as a whole lose more and more knowledge, as the powerful hide away things they find preventing any in the future from knowing them. While this information may exist in some form locked away in a forgotten place, the rest of the world simply won't know about it until it's publicized. Nick explained honestly. No one argued with him either, as he was correct about those with power keeping their research and knowledge secret from others, as each person here with any achievement under their belt had done so themselves. What about lycanthropy then? If it is as you said, then why hasn't it been corrected yet, since it should be easy? Lupin asked, finding the solution to his curse was an easily fixable mistake hard to swallow. Nick smiled mockingly. The answer to that was sheer bad luck for the werewolves. Those who wanted to fix it lacked the ability or talent to learn how, while those who could fix it lacked the will to try. Basically, the entire werewolf problem was because no one actually cares about it at all until they themselves are afflicted. There may be a few rare exceptions, but otherwise that is the reality of it. To summarize, bad luck for the werewolves. Nick said with a chuckle at the awkward expressions everyone in the room had as Lupin looked around. Take me, for example. Even now, I don't care about the matter past the benefits it offers me. I may not be a cruel or apathetic individual, but I am also no saint that will waste his time on a matter that neither benefits nor concerns myself. Nick added, making everyone but Snape stare at him in shock. Nick was a pragmatist at heart, and it had always shown in every action he took, as they all benefited or concerned him or those around him. Everyone here, except Lupin, was aware of this, but had never expected Nick to lay it out so bluntly. Snape wasn't surprised, though, as it seemed only natural in his eyes that a person like Nick wouldn't mince words for no good reason. It was a trait he admired greatly, as such frankness led to the greatest of loyalty in those who chose to follow others. While it hurts to see that, here I thank you for your honesty in this matter. What do you gain from helping me, if I may ask? Lupin said, with a depressed sag in his demeanor. This is a many birds with one stone sort of a situation. Nick said with a grin. See, I happen to need quite a lot of data on animagi magics, so I may modify the ritual to my own needs in the future, which studying your condition will provide me. In addition to this, your long-term presence in the school as the Dada professor will improve the quality of the graduates by several levels. Then there is the immediate gain of your relationship with my best friend Harry, whom I believe you still haven't introduced yourself to. A poor decision, but yours to make. Finally, though, and you'll all love this one, you'll be a slap in Voldemort's face, as one of his enemies takes the position he longed to occupy years back. As I said, many birds with one stone. Nick said with a smile, while most of the professors realized that he had really thought about the matter. How long do you need to remove this curse? Dumbledore asked seriously, since he was now certain that Nick was confident in this regard. Remove it. Impossible. Nick stated firmly, surprising everyone here and leaving Lupin horrified. Animagi magic is soul and body-based, and Lupin has had the curse for far too long to remove it without ripping his soul itself to pieces. Rather than remove it, it would be more accurate to say that my method is replacing the faulty parts of the magic with the improved, better ones. I can't remove the curse, but I can certainly turn it into a blessing instead, Nick said with a wide smile. 313. Chapter 313. Everyone except Snape sighed in relief when they heard him say this. Had us worried there for a moment, Nick. Flitwick said honestly. Nick shrugged. To be totally honest, lycanthropy's creation is a fairly easy thing to deduce once you have all these details. The wizard or witch behind it likely had a wolf as their patroness, but was unhappy with simply turning into a normal wolf via the standard animagus ritual, and thus tried to modify the ritual to turn into a magical wolf. They actually got fairly close too, from what I can tell. See, they added a component to the magic that made the transformed state of the finished product have the standard magical beasts features, such as magic resistance and powerful body. However, they did this through a form of life magic, I suppose you could call it. This is where the infectiveness of the curse came from, as it made the magic itself have properties of a living thing, which included propagation. They also used a botched form of soul manipulation magic to try and modify their form from pure wolfen to a larger, more robust form without taking the necessary steps to ensure stability. Altogether, this curse is a half-baked idea at best. Nick criticized disdainfully. I would need to witness a transformation personally before I can even consider trying to mess with the curse, though since at the moment it's dormant, but at the time of the full moon it will become active and may have more nuanced aspects I can't sense at the moment. Nick added honestly. Dumbledore nodded in understanding, a reasonable request considering the circumstances of the matter. As luck would have it, the next full moon is next week on Wednesday, he said calmly. Lupin looked horrified at the very idea of Nick being anywhere near him when he transformed. You need not worry yourself, Professor Lupin, as I doubt the old man would leave me without some form of protection. Nick pointed out to help calm the man. That is correct, as I myself, or one of the other professors, will be present to prevent any mishaps. Dumbledore said, in agreement, which did help Lupin to relax a little. Before anything else is discussed, however, I believe it's time to talk about the true reason that you have been called here today, Mr. Ravenclaw. Dumbledore then spoke seriously. Exactly how far ahead of your peers in terms of studying? He asked sternly. Nick thought about it for a moment before replying, about the middle of the fourth year in most classes, and postgraduate in the case of runes and transfiguration. I have currently been studying arithmancy, but have trouble with it, since I need to be very careful, as the tomes on the subject lack many details. Nick answered without holding back at all. Everyone in the room sucked in a breath of air at his answer, as they knew he was advanced, but not that advanced. As the people in charge of those subjects, they knew better than anyone how big of a qualitative difference the subject matter is from the second year in comparison to the fourth. The matter of transfiguration was an entirely different thing, since they had already been aware of that due to his regular use of the subject openly. Runes, on the other hand, was a surprise that came out of nowhere. Sure, they knew that Nick likely was a little aware of them, thanks to his apprenticeship with Ollivander, but clearly he was far more than just familiar with the subject. I see. Then there is no problem with what we professors have decided to do in light of the return of Voldemort, as well as the value of your time. It was thoroughly discussed between all of us, and we have all agreed that your continued attendance of class with your peers for the moment is a waste of both your and their time. I am prepared to exempt you from all classes for the rest of the year, and possibly the next, so long as you pass the exams for this year's classes early. While we are reluctant to admit it, your time and talents would be better spent self-studying and preparing for the troubles to come. Those rings of protection you make, for example, are quickly becoming necessary for many, and we all agree that you spending your time helping prepare us is better than sticking so strictly to tradition. Dumbledore spoke slowly but seriously, and Nick's jaw hit the floor. It needs to be understood that in 1,000 years of history, since the school had been founded, not a single student had been exempted from class for more than a couple months, depending on the severity of the situation. 314. Chapter 314. To say that Nick was surprised by this turn of events would be a huge understatement, as he was entirely speechless. He had at most expected that he would get 1 or 2 classes exempted or reduced to give him more time to improve himself, but full exemption had never even crossed his mind. Nick knew that the only reason the professors were even making this decision was that there was now 2 Dark Lords active at the same time, and only 1 Dumbledore. The man himself was stretched thin trying to track down Grindelwald and his followers, so throwing another Dark Lord into the mix was simply far too much for him to handle. Add on that Nick's creations were capable of filling any need that may arise, and he was suddenly a very valuable resource to be utilized as much as possible to protect innocence. In peaceful times, this would never happen, but the conditions were just right for an exception to be made on his behalf. While this is a fantastic opportunity, it also comes with a heavy responsibility. Though I suppose having to double or triple up on my protective rings is a small price to pay for such a thing. He thought seriously. If the exams are on the content of this year's classes, it should be a problem to pass them. That said, how exactly are we doing this, and what exactly do you all want out of it? Nick asked, so he knew exactly what he was getting himself into. Each of my colleagues have agreed to individually test you in their field of teaching over the next week, with the exception of myself, since there is little doubt of your transfigurative abilities. McGonagall said sternly. Nick nodded in agreement. That's fair enough, but that didn't answer my second question. What do you all want from me specifically? Because I doubt it is only an increase in production for the rings of protection. He said seriously. You are correct, Mr. Ravenclaw. Snape spoke up at this point. In exchange for this exemption, you are required to not only provide many more of those rings, but also need to provide as many different types of offensive artifact as possible for the battle ahead. He spoke with a calm and cold tone that brokered no arguments. Nick ran through a list of different possible enchantments he could make for offensive means and frowned. That was a very long list, and while he doubted that he actually needed to provide all of those options to them, even a fraction of them would be enough to level a continent. Not all at once, mind you, since he wasn't that powerful, but if they were all used in separate locations, simultaneously, the maps would definitely need to be redrawn. It should not be too much of a problem so long as the enchantments aren't very complex. That reminds me for whatever reason, but I have something that should be able to kill immortal evil creatures, he said, taking out a soul-shot arrow. Snape immediately clutched his right arm, where the dark mark was located, as the mere presence of the arrow made it hurt. I wasn't aware that you made weapons as well, Dumbledore said, surprised at the item that he could feel's powerful purifying and anti-evil properties. Nick shrugged. I was always able to make weapons, and even armor. I just prefer rings is all, he said honestly. Flitwick walked over to Nick and examined the arrow he was holding with furrowed eyebrows. Is something the matter, Phileas? McGonagall asked, concerned at the look on the half-goblin's face. This arrow is very strange. I don't recognize any of the materials at all, and the enchantment simply doesn't exist. It's like the arrow doesn't have magic, but is magic. Small Professor said seriously, as he racked his brain trying to wrap his head around what he was seeing. Nick was surprised at how fast the secret of the arrow was discovered, but after considering that Flitwick was a master enchanter, it wasn't all that strange. Correct on all account, Professor. This arrow was made using a very special method I came up with, Nick said with a grin. You make us older generations look bad by creating brand new methods like this, you know, Flitwick said with a sigh. If it helps, this new method is quite a bit more limited in versatility than my original, Nick said with a smirk. How so? Dumbledore asked curiously. I have no reason to keep it a secret, since observing the creations closely would reveal their nature. I found a way to congeal the magical nature of the celestial bodies in the sky, such as the stars, sun, and moon. This arrow, for example, is the magic of the sun condensed into item form, he said proudly. 315. Chapter 315. Dumbledore and the rest's eyes lit up with interest at that news, since this was a very novel and interesting idea that affected many fields of study. For potions, there was many a brew that required a specific set of moonlight, as well as certain lunar or solar phenomena to finish. For transfiguration, the animagus ritual itself, as well as a few others, used lunar or solar energies to perform. Plants need not be mentioned in this regard, while charms and alchemy fell in the same category as transfiguration and potions in the need for those specific conditions. Nick didn't hesitate to take a small piece of the light material from his realm to show them what he meant. This is the unshaped solar magic material. Feel free to run some tests on it, he said while placing it on the headmaster's desk. Each of the academics eagerly pulled off a piece of the material to run their own tests on the stuff. What an unusual material. It appears hard, yet is soft and malleable to the touch, while simultaneously seeming to be pure magic. Dumbledore said, fascinated with the sample he had. The other academics were no better as they each tested it in various ways, with Snape's test having the most volatile results by far. Apparently, he placed a tiny amount of the material in a vial and mixed in some sort of clear potion that caused the material to break down and turn the potion orange and yellow before the mixture turned violent from the now formless energy of the material, causing an explosion of purifying and anti-evil energies. Everyone was unharmed, with the exception of himself, that now had a terrible burn on his arm where the dark mark used to be. Yes, the dark mark was completely gone from him, which made his face go extremely pale. Nick could not blame him either, as Voldemort was not likely to be happy about this when he figured out what had happened. See, the magic of the mark was of the permanently affixed sort that was tied to the life of a single individual. This meant that the only thing theoretically able to remove the mark was that individual or something capable of totally cutting the connection of the mark to them. Voldemort used the mark to track and message his followers, so if one of them betrayed him, they can't hide from his wrath. If the mark could be removed, however, he would lose that leverage which was unacceptable to a controlling individual like him. When Snape inevitably returns to the man to get a new mark, he will need to tell what it was that caused the mark to vanish. Snape basically had no choice but to spill the beans about Nick's new material. With that, I believe, we should call this meeting to an end. Dumbledore said, as his good mood was now ruined with the unfortunate repercussions of this event. Nick could only chuckle awkwardly, since technically this situation could be considered his fault to a degree. To be fair, though, how was he supposed to know that the material turns into an anti-evil grenade after losing cohesion? Still, it wasn't all bad news, though, as he at least learned something new thanks to this happening. Time began to pass by after that, and as per the agreement, Nick went through the exams early, much to Hermione's envy. She was more advanced than the rest of their year as well, but not by as wide a margin as Nick, and she lacked the ability to really be of use in the battles ahead, and as such did not get the same offer. This unfortunately meant that she was going to fall even further behind Nick, as he now had much more free time to spend studying. The biggest thing that happened, however, was that the moment Nick finished the last exam, he received 2 missions from the system. Mission conditions established. Description: hardship lurks around the corner, and you've promised aid in exchange for exemption from all classes. Time to fulfill your end of the bargain. Objectives: create 250,000 rings of protection, create a large variety of offensive rings in bulk, optional, create a full set of rare tier armor, optional rewards, space and you. Book, Song of Shields, book, optional, X-crafting method ticket, optional status. Incomplete mission conditions established. Description: you have promised Lupin to turn his curse into a blessing, so do it. Objectives: fix the flawed parts of the curse, publicize the method used, optional, improve upon the foundation of the curse to create a magical wolf animagus, optional rewards. 3x item tickets of beasts and men, book, optional, Deidre Hart status, incomplete. 316. Chapter 316. Nick was surprised by these 2 missions popping up, but was more than happy to take them on. The first one was obviously going to take quite some time to fulfill, since that amount of rings was no simple amount. To put it into perspective, he could at the moment make 20 rings of protection before he needed to refill his energy stores. He could also only refill his energy stores 3 times a day. This meant that if he focused only on making those rings of protection, he could make 60 of them per day. At that rate, it would take him nearly 20 years to complete this mission, which was clearly unacceptable to him. Thankfully, he had a few options to increase his crafting ability dramatically to shorten that time frame greatly. He could accept the mission taking 2 or even 3 years to complete at his current speed of crafting, but 20 was too much. The options he had available to him at the moment was to figure out how to automate the crafting process for the rings so he could churn them out at a much faster pace, the ritual of breath, creating an energy reservoir and generally mastering his style of crafting even further. The first option is too time-consuming, so that's out for now. I can definitely complete the ritual thanks to Helena's modification of it. Creating a reservoir is also fairly possible, but then I would need to convince others to donate mana while also somehow purifying it for my own consumption. As for mastering the style further, that's basically a joke since I already have nearly 90% mastery of it, and that last 10% is really only being held back by my lack of power spiritually. He thought seriously while messing with some of the sun's light material in his realm. The realm doesn't directly increase his power at all, but gave the unique benefit of boosting his understanding of whatever happened or existed within it by stupidly high levels. The downside to this was that this understanding was on the micro scale when focused, so he couldn't use this to basically download the entire library's content into his head at once. The reason for this was that the words written on the pages of books was apparently in the sweet spot of normal perception that the realm didn't cover. That said, it was perfect for his experiments, as it allowed him to figure out what each small change he made did. Yeah, I think that ritual is probably my best option at the moment, he thought as he condensed the sun material into a dagger with a smile. The sun's light material had a strong proclivity towards weaponry, so with the help of his realm Nick had figured out how to change the stuff into other forms besides the arrows, but only other weapons so far. Still, progress was progress, and he was more than happy with what he was getting. Leaving the realm Nick sighed as he found Dumbledore waiting for him in the workshop. The old man was admiring the astral hammer and anvil he had at the moment, so he didn't notice Nick return to the real world. "What can I help you with, Professor?" Nick asked, startling the man slightly. "These items here are simply fascinating, my boy. Can you tell me where you got them from?" The old man asked curiously. "They came from myself, of course. I based them off of a mysterious place I found before school last year," Nick said casually. Dumbledore looked enlightened after hearing this. So that was what happened at that time. Nico and I were wondering where the craftsman who entered the astral realm vanished to. The old man said, leaving Nick dumbfounded. "You entered that place shortly after creating your crafting and enchanting method, correct?" Dumbledore asked with smile after seeing Nick's expression. "I thought," Nick started before Dumbledore finished the statement, "that the astral realm was something only you knew about. Sorry to say you are both wrong and right at the same time," he said with a sad sigh. "It's a legendary place that all true experts in the crafting community are aware of, but has strict requirements to enter. You likely only managed to enter because you created something totally new, and the realm acknowledged it. Judging from the time frame you entered, I assume you didn't leave an imprint on the realm to return at will," Dumbledore asked, and Nick nodded in confirmation. "A pity, but to be expected, I suppose. Nico will be quite disheartened by the news." He was very much looking forward to meeting someone else with access to that place, you know. "If it's not too much trouble, could I by chance purchase an item like these two from you? I believe they merit study," the old goat requested. 317. Chapter 317. This request caught Nick off guard, but was fairly easy to fulfill, so he simply nodded. "Give me a bit of time, and I should be able to get another hammer to you. Consider it an early Christmas gift," he said, and the old man smiled happily. While Nick may not like the old man, he was also aware that having him at his back was worth doing, since, after the mana concentration increases, he will likely quickly grow more powerful. Nick wasn't stupid enough to think that someone like Dumbledore was unaware of how to take that step to the next rank. A rank 5 wizard on his side will come in handy at the early stages of the world's recovery when the guards haven't been unsealed yet. After that, though Nick doubted that the old man was going to survive very long at all. Dumbledore was not the sort of person to shy away from a fight with a tyrannical powerhouse, and as a result would likely confront Zeus, which definitely won't end well for the old goat. There was no way in hell that Zeus wasn't flat-out bad news for the world on a scale that the likes of Voldemort could only have wet dreams about. Nick wasn't sure how Grindelwald would play out the future, though since the only thing he knew about was the flooding the planet in mana plan, but the rest was totally blank. "We have gotten off topic, it seems," Dumbledore said with a chuckle. "Yes, we have. Speaking of, what is it I can help you with today?" Nick asked curiously, since he couldn't think of a reason for the old man's visit. I have received a rather interesting opportunity that I felt you may appreciate given your unique situation. Dumbledore said mysteriously. Which part of my situation exactly? Nick asked, while trying to figure out what the opportunity the old man may be talking about was. He couldn't help but curse at how little the world beyond Harry was explained in the books, as he drew a blank. The real magical world was many times more complicated and detailed than the stuff mentioned in the books, to the point of even being misleading. Sure, the real thing was way more magical than portrayed, but it was also a million times more dangerous as well. To be specific, I am referring to your familiar in this case. You see, every year Beauxbaton's Academy of Magic hosts a competition of sorts with grand prizes to the top three. Dumbledore said, with a twinkle in his eyes that confused Nick. What does that have to do with Nazgul? He asked, interested. Everything, my boy. You see, the competition is a magical beast beauty pageant that the school uses to inspire the fashion industry in France. It also doubles as a good way to introduce new magical creatures to the world safely. The old goat said, with a smirk that Nick shared after seeing the benefits this could bring him. It was hard to ignore the fact that despite being registered in the ministry, Nazgul, who was a ringbeast, a/n, that's what I'm calling the species, was a huge unknown to the rest of the world and might cause him problems when he travels about in the future. The trafficking of magical beasts was a seriously regulated and stern matter. If some mistake was made during the paperwork needed to travel to other places, he would be looking at a very hefty fine or even imprisonment, while Nazgul was detained or flat out executed. This beauty pageant would be the perfect way to introduce Nazgul to the wider world so that this problem wouldn't likely happen. I assume that this pageant is coming up soon since you are here now, he asked, and Dumbledore nodded. It begins on the 11th, in fact. I wanted to see if you were interested, so I could apply for a travel permit for you to the event, as that will take a couple days, and it is in 4 days. He explained honestly. I am indeed quite interested in participating to see what sort of clothes she inspires, if nothing else. Nick said with a grin. Dumbledore was already prepared for Nick to show interest in the event and brought the paperwork with him. Nick carefully read through the stuff before signing anything which Dumbledore could only sigh at. Broken trust is really hard to fix with him, the old man thought as he left to get all this stuff filed away at the ministry. Nick, meanwhile, took out the diagram for the ritual of breath to look it over. There weren't many changes from the original, but there were a few bits that had been modified. 318. Chapter 318. Nick had long since acquired the lungs of a dragon for this ritual, and had thus had literally no reason at all to hold off on it any more now that he had the time to undergo the ritual. He had specifically chosen the lungs of a Swedish short snout for this ritual, because it was one of the only dragons to have an unusually attributed flame. Unlike normal flames from a dragon, this species had blue flames that were powerful enough to turn wood and bone to ash in a couple seconds. Nick theorized that this was likely because their lungs had a higher magical concentration than other species, and thus hoped it would give him a better result. There were no real preparations needed to perform this ritual other than collecting the ingredients and drawing out the ritual circle. After being allowed to do as she wished freely, Helena had been spending less and less time in the workshop or accompanying Nick lately. Today was no different as last he checked. She was gorging herself silly at Hogsmeade. This absence didn't bother him very much, as he knew that she would return after she had her fill of corporeal life again. Nick locked up the workshop as he left before heading to the 7th floor to use the room of requirement for the ritual. He, of course, made sure to enter the room in secret, since things would get rather complicated if someone were to enter the room whilst he was there. This time the room was very bland and empty, which was what he had wanted, as he needed a space to draw the ritual circle without any obstacles. The circle itself was consisted of a string of rune words encircling a hexagram that had the lungs placed in the north and south points of the hexagram. Once Nick was done drawing the circle and triple-checking to make sure it was all correct, he stepped into the center and took a deep breath before speaking. Ut spiro draconis pulmo muse. Magimi implit et florit. As I breathe, let my lungs be those of a dragon. Let magic fill me and flourish. He spoke clearly and concisely, and immediately he felt his magic drain into the ritual circle that began to glow. The lungs quickly dried up and turned to dust as the ritual worked before that same dust flew into his nose and mouth. Nick had to resist the urge to gag reflexively as he felt to his knees as a blisteringly hot pain filled his chest. He panted, and wisps of blue flame left his mouth as the pain grew more and more intense. During this entire time, the ritual circle had never stopped siphoning off his mana, so he was also getting more and more tired as his stores grew lower and lower. After 15 minutes of agony, though Nick sighed in relief as the ritual ended, he tentatively took in a breath and immediately felt the ambient magic get sucked into his nose and assimilated into his body from his lungs. That one breath alone recovered a noticeable amount of mana for him, which excited him. Curious to see if he had any other bonuses from the ritual like the blue flames he let out previously. Taking a deep breath, Nick, instead of absorbing the mana into his body, had his lungs absorb it before breathing out. Heat rose from his throat as the breath came up, and out of his mouth poured a stream of azure flame that scorched the air on contact. He was genuinely confused about this, as he had not read that this ritual gave its caster the properties of the lungs used. This whole test was actually meant as a joke attempt to breath fire, not actually breath the stuff. I have a sneaking suspicion that Helena modified the ritual more than I told her to. Nick thought with sigh as he rubbed his forehead. For now, though, he chose to put this matter to the side as he wiped away the evidence of his ritual from the room. A small misconception that many had about the room was that after you leave it resets everything in it. The truth of the matter was that this was half correct, since it did do that, but only after making a magical imprint of that room that could be summoned by whoever later. Nick only learned this thanks to Helena revealing it, or else he would have not cared enough to take the time to wipe out all traces of the ritual. Still, this ritual is good stuff, as in only 30 minutes I've recovered my full reserves, he thought with a smile. 319. Chapter 319. My judgment isn't wrong, then my forging rate has increased by nearly 4 times. This should put me at about 240 rings a day if I focus on it exclusively, meaning I'd now only need about 3 years to complete this mission's main objective. He worked it all out as he left the room that was scrubbed clean of his ritual. The next few days passed by quickly as he constantly churned out rings of protection that he turned over to Dumbledore for the price he sold them for last year. He wasn't wrong about how much of an increase he had experienced in his recovery speed, and thus forging rate, as he topped out at the exact number of rings he predicted previously, though he noticed that the rings he was making were nearly twice as good as the previous iteration. It wasn't hard for him to figure out exactly why that was either. See, the method he used to enchant the rings worked based on his own knowledge and experience with a subject, and he had never stopped working on his understanding of shield spells, which was what caused this change, even thought the enchantment itself was pretty much the exact same. Still, the day of the full moon finally arrived, and Nick wasted no time at all collecting the various analytic measures he needed to study the changes in Lupin. Amongst these was a ring that worked to create a copy of the wearer's life force signature during a period of time. With this, Nick merely needed to collect the ring from Lupin after the effect was triggered in order to learn how the magic changed the life force of him. The rest was mostly thing to take skin, hair, and blood samples to compare to a set of the same samples from when Lupin was in his human state. Nick had of course asked for consent before collecting any of these things, since it was only proper. Once the sun started to lower, Dumbledore came personally to take Nick to the location Lupin would transform. He was not surprised to see that it was the Shrieking Shack of all places. As they arrived, they noticed a pale-faced Lupin waiting within nervously. "No need to worry, Professor. I have thoroughly prepared for this event. Could you please put this ring on?" Nick asked with a reassuring smile. "What does it do?" Lupin asked while putting it on. "It creates a recording of your life force that I can then analyze later to learn how transforming affects it." Nick explained, since he felt there was no reason to hide it. "You truly have prepared well, it would seem," Dumbledore said with a raised eyebrow. "I take my work very seriously," Nick said with a grin that seemed to relax Lupin a bit. Couldn't be blamed for being nervous, as he of all people was aware of the danger posed by his werewolf form. That was the cruel part of the curse. The werewolf remembers everything they did while transformed, as if they were a prisoner in their own body. If it makes you feel better, I intend to paralyze you after you transform so I can collect the last samples, so you will be no danger at all to anyone else. Nick added helpfully, and Lupin nodded before it changed into a waiting game. To pass time, Nick chatted with Dumbledore and Lupin on his progress with the Patronus charm. Neither of them were all that surprised that he could use it, since he was studying the animagus transformation, and one's Patronus usually was also their animal form. Dumbledore was more than happy to share a few of the ways he had figured out how to use the spell, from delivering messages to driving off many evil creatures at once. Even Lupin couldn't help but relax and get lured into the conversation. Despite the way he has spent the last decade or so, he was a scholarly sort and loved learning new information. Soon, though, he started to groan as the moon's influence called to his curse. Nick stepped away from the man alongside Dumbledore, who drew the Elder Wand and held it at the ready. Bones cracked and shifted as Lupin began to change, but Nick was far more interested in the incredible difference between the active curse and passive one in his magical senses. The passive curse seemed broken but quiet, but the active one was like a car that had the wrong parts installed, as it was louder and far more discordant. He frowned, though, when he noticed the damage that this transformation was doing to Lupin's body. No wonder werewolves feel terrible after they turn back. Their body is literally tearing itself apart. He thought seriously. 320. Chapter 320. Dumbledore watched the scene of Lupin transforming with a sad expression, but didn't allow his mind to fall into the trap of melancholy. Freshly transformed, werewolves seemed harmless at first, but the moment they noticed you, it was an instant shift in temperament to a savage and violent one. Nick was also very much aware of this, so when the transformation ended, he wasted no time at all tapping his wand against the floor. The werewolf Lupin was startled as thick metal chains and shackles shot out of the floor and bound each of its limbs in 3 places before wrapping around its muzzle to prevent even the slightest chance of it biting them. Dumbledore waved his wand, adding his own layer of bindings to the struggling creature, preventing any and all movement. Without missing, a beat Nick rushed over and went to work collecting the samples he needed, as well as the ring on Lupin's digit that had served its purpose. We can leave now, since I have all the information I can get without risking my possessions and placing him in my ring for deeper analysis. Nick spoke calmly as he left the growling and snarling creature behind. Dumbledore nodded and waved his hand again, covering Lupin's eyes, as they walked out, at which point he quickly removed the restraints on it and locked the door behind him as they left. Nick heard the creature roar angrily and crash against the door in a worrying manner. No need to be concerned. This shack was specially reinforced so as to hold a werewolf during the previous headmaster's time, so the poor students with the curse need not worry about harming others during their monthly transformation. Dumbledore said reassuringly. That is good. A werewolf released in such close proximity to Hogsmeade would be quite bad, Nick said, and the old man nodded seriously. On to a better topic. I just this evening received your travel paperwork for tomorrow, the old goat said, before reaching into his robes and taking out a few items. The first was magical passport of sorts, with all of his information on it, as well as a magical imprint waiting to be filled by him. This was to make sure that even under Polyjuice, it was impossible for someone to travel legally to another country, even if they somehow stole his passport. The second item was a card that expanded to show all of his legal paperwork for his travel visa, so that he could just hand over the card when he arrived, while showing his passport to legally get welcomed to magical France. Nick may not be a huge fan or bureaucracy in general, but he was willing to admit that it had its uses in some cases. Thank you. I imagine you will be apparating us to the ministry, so we could take the long-distance flu soon, Nick asked, and the old man smiled mischievously. Right now, in fact, he said before grabbing Nick by the arm and apparating in an instant. Nick didn't have time to brace himself at all, as he felt like he was getting squeezed through a straw belly first. His reflexes may have told him about Dumbledore's movement the moment it started, but the close proximity made dodging impossible. When they landed at their destination, Nick had to fight with his stomach that was threatening revolt at the mistreatment. Dumbledore merely chuckled at his successful prank, despite the glare Nick sent him. "I bloody hate apparition," Nick hissed as he steadied himself. "You are certainly not alone in that sentiment, though I personally find the magic quite pleasant," Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick snorted at that before walking into the Ministry building impatiently. Much like Hogwarts, it is impossible to apparate directly into the Ministry in most cases, so they were outside it at the moment. It wasn't late enough for the Ministry to close, just yet, so they had no trouble at all getting to use the long-distance flu to France. The flu network was an interesting thing in that it actually had no set distance that it couldn't be used. Thanks to this, each ministry in the world had a long-distance flu that connected to the other ministries alone. Nick found flu travel slightly more bearable than apparition, as instead of feeling like you were getting sucked through a straw by your belly button, it felt more like falling down a really deep hole. The flames were mostly just for opening the way, while the actual travel was fairly peaceful, if rather dirty. No matter how clean you were, when stepping into the flu, you will always come out the other side with soot and ash on you. 321. Chapter 321. The French ministry was very different than the British one in both design and feel, as the British ministry was cold stone and metal that had a serious and unfriendly atmosphere to it. The French ministry, on the other hand, had rich wooden offices built in a vertical manner that circled around the inside of the building, with the exception of 4 large hallways in each direction. The stone was a warm golden marble, while the statues were polished bronze, that all in total made the place way more friendly feeling as far as Nick was concerned. Papers. The brown-haired woman wearing a suit sitting behind a desk next to the flu demanded in a heavily accented English. Nick and Dumbledore handed over the paperwork smoothly, and the woman checked them over carefully. She paused slightly when she got to Dumbledore's paperwork, but snapped out of it quickly and took out a stamp that she tapped on a certain spot of the passports. "Everything is in order, please enjoy your stay," she said, handing the paperwork back much more respectfully this time. "Thank you, we will certainly try," Dumbledore said in French with a smile. "Come along, Nick, we still need to find a room for our stay," the old man said before leading the way. "That's good, Nazgul and Dusk are getting antsy from being cooped up in my ring," Nick said with a chuckle. Dusk needed to be brought along since he both refused to be left behind and was sure to cause trouble if left to his own devices. Steve, on the other hand, was left in the care of Luna and the other girls, who practically jumped at the chance. Even if Nazgul was the favorite of his beast companions, Steve was still adored by everyone. "That reminds me, for whatever reason, but will Fox be joining us?" Nick asked curiously. "Indeed, he will, but unlike us, he will be flying to whole way here. It is quite the rare treat for him to make such a long journey, and I couldn't deny him the experience in good conscience," Dumbledore said with a smile. Nick could understand this easily, since even Nazgul liked to stretch her wings on campus when she could. It had caused a rather funny incident, in fact, not long ago, when she joined the Gryffindor team's practice and proved to be a better player than most of the team's members. She was faster, better at flying, had very sharp eyes, and was horribly strong for her size. All of this combined meant she was able to steal the quaffle easily, beat off the bludgers, and snatch the snitch before Harry could even see it. Oliver Wood died a little inside that day. Anyways, it didn't take the two of them to leave the ministry, though Nick did see a 2-tailed black cat in it that made him a little uncomfortable. He recognized them from the magical beast encyclopedia that was part of the first-year supply list as Necomata. These magical creatures were the bane of nearly all wizards, as any magic you hit them with caused them to split into 2 separate Necomata. They were as such typically used as guards for treasures or information, since they were the living embodiment of the term swarm tactics. Nick knew that this creature was here as a warning to the two of them not to cause any problems, as the creatures rarely left their territory unless instructed to. Dumbledore saw the creature as well, but merely scoffed at it. He couldn't be blamed either, as so long as he wanted to cause problems. There was no way the ministry here could stop him, and they knew it, so the warning was stupid. Still, The Ministry of Magic for France was very different than the one for Britain, as it was actually located beneath the Muggle parliamentary building in the middle of Paris. This came as a shock to Nick, to say the least, as this was a ballsy choice to say the least. The entrance and exit to the place was an illusioned staircase built into the middle of the floor that had Muggle-repellent wards all around it, as well as notice-me-not charms. Not a single Muggle so much as batted an eye when Nick and Dumbledore seemed to appear out of nowhere. I sometimes wonder if I am the odd one for thinking about it, or if everyone else is the strange ones for not. Nick thought, as they moved through the large doors of the building and onto the street. Paris at night time was quite the sight, as the Eiffel Tower was lit up in the distance, and various colorful streetlights filled the city as the people in it went about their late evening business. 322. Chapter 322. Now, to find a place to stay for the night, if memory serves, there should be a place not far from here, Dumbledore said casually before starting to walk in a certain direction. Nick could only helplessly follow behind, as he was in a totally different country of which he legitimately knows little about really. If he was dealing with wizards, he would be fine since he was fairly wealthy and spoke fluent French, but with Muggles, he knew absolutely nothing about their culture or customs, and wizarding money was useless to them beyond the material value. The old goat seemed to know what he was talking about, though, as they soon came across an old-looking hostel with a pub below it that reminded Nick a suspicious amount of the Leaky Cauldron. It was dirty and ill-lit, with various drunk wizards sitting about. Welcome to the Cracked Goblet, Foreign Friends, the old bartender said, with the first couple words being in French, until he keenly noticed we weren't and switched to English. Nick was pretty sure that the barkeep knew who Dumbledore was, and thus switched to English, since he was not in any clothes that would give away his nationality. Look at the stupid Englishmen, probably here to sightsee. Damn tourists. One of the tipsy wizards said, not quietly at all in French. Look at the foolish Frenchman making an ass of himself while wasting his coin on cheap booze. Nick bit back in French, making the whole pub go silent for a moment before bursting into uproarious laughter. Dumbledore raised a surprised eyebrow at Nick. I wasn't aware you knew French. He with a curious undertone. Nick smirked. I have a bit of talent at learning new languages, so I picked it up in my free time along with several others, he said, playing it off easily. You've got a sharp tongue, brat. Have a slice of pie on me, the tipsy wizard said with a laugh before tossing a galleon to the barkeep. It was at this point Nick realized the sort of people French folk probably were. They were probably passionate and brave people that wore their hearts on their sleeves and loved a good verbal sparring. Still, Nick wasn't one to turn down free calories and happily accepted the slice of apple pie. Dumbledore could only smile and leave the matter alone and talk with the barkeeper into getting a couple of rooms for the night. He succeeded, and Nick returned the plate and fork to the barkeeper after using a cleaning spell on them. It was a good pie, he complimented in French as they walked up the stairs to their rooms. The rooms were not 5-star quality or anything, but were clean and quiet thanks to the silencing charms on them. Nick let Dusk and Nazgul out of the realm, where they immediately looked over the room in judgment. None of that, you two. We're guests here, so be respectful. Nick chided the two beasts sternly. Nazgul merely snorted before hopping onto the bed and laying down, while Dusk looked away and perched on the window sill instead, while looking out the window. Nick shook his head at this, before moving Nazgul over so he could go to bed. He had no trouble drifting off to sleep at all, and slept soundly through the night. He woke up at about 7 in the morning and stretched with a yawn. There was a slight difference in time between the Isle and France, so he hadn't actually slept in at all. Dusk and Nazgul were less than pleased when he put them back inside the realm before he left the room and walked down the stairs to the pub below that was somehow just as busy as the night before. As much good food you can give me for this, Nick said in French, putting 30 galleons on the counter as he sat down. The barkeeper counted it out with a confused look before Dumbledore's voice sounded out from nearby. He really does have that large of an appetite, he said, and the barkeeper looked doubtful, but chose to take the money anyways. Nick got a whole assortment of fruit, bread, pastries, and a small amount of bacon for his money, which, while lacking in proteins, was fine by him. The entire bar watched in amazement as Nick rapidly devoured the spread down to the last crumb. Where does a small thing like you even put that amount of food? The barkeeper couldn't help but ask curiously. Nick merely rolled up his sleeve to show his lean, defined arm muscles. I am no slouch, he stated with a smirk. 323. Chapter 323. So it is. If I'd have known you were fueling a body like that, I'd have given you more meat, the barkeeper said with a laugh. You two here for the pageant, I take it? The man asked while polishing a mug with a cloth. How'd you guess? Nick asked in surprise, since as far as he knew neither of them had mentioned it before now. Dumbledore's been sent an invitation to participate for years now on account of the phoenix that keeps him company. Madame Maxim has had her eye on getting a dress inspired by it for quite some time now. Can't blame her, it's a majestic creature without a doubt, the man explained with a smile. I figured he finally decided to indulge her on account of a juicy bit of information I heard from one of my ministry regulars in the games department. He added, but Dumbledore stopped him from saying more. There's no guarantee that we'll even go through, so no need to get his hopes up. The headmaster said sternly, so the barkeeper dropped the topic. Nick already had an idea of what was being talked about and wasn't surprised to hear it. Despite how it seemed in the book, there was no way in hell that a massive international event like the Triwizard Tournament was set up in the space of a few months that happened between the third and fourth year. Rather than think that Voldemort, who didn't have any followers other than Peter and Barty Crouch Jr. at the time, could set up such a thing, it was more probable he simply used it to his benefit. Even now Nick could understand why Dumbledore would be trying to hold such an event, what with Grindelwald causing chaos and Voldemort returning. With all the bad stuff going on, what better a way to boost morale than to show the three Western academies of magic competing in a friendly, definitely not, manner. Still, Nick didn't say anything to show that he actually knew what was being talked about and merely waited for the old man to finish his own breakfast. After that, they left the hostel and went back to the ministry to take the flu to Beauxbatons, since apparition directly there was forbidden. They weren't the only ones either, as a few dozen people with cages of various sizes were also waiting for the chance to flew over. Nick found it fairly clear that most of these people were only here just because they felt like it with some of the creatures he saw in the cages. Horned toads, man-eating slugs, and a boggart that seemed to be having an identity crisis with the amount of forms it was shifting between. None of these had any beauty to them at all, unless you had something wrong with your mind. The real competitors, though, had their cages covered with cloth or stored in spatial equipment. There was also quite a few people that were merely designers or spectators that included a certain influential French pureblood family. The women of that family were gawking at Nick quite openly, much to the confusion of the men. Nick smirked and tipped his head slightly in acknowledgement before ignoring them as he was studying the magical items on each person nearby. He may not be able to see the runes directly, but he could still figure out what the items did, and as a result attempt to mimic them later. It might not be plagiarism exactly, but he was definitely towing that line. The only reason he was even doing this was so he could pass the information on to Hermione and Daphne as a Christmas present. Still, despite his choosing to ignore the Delacour family, it didn't mean they did the same, or rather could do the same. His mere presence seemed to suppress them to an uncomfortable degree, like what a peasant might feel when presented before a powerful king. The worst part is that they had no idea why this was, and that made it hard for them to do anything besides stare at Nick. Do either of you know what is going on with them? One of the older men in a suit asked worriedly. Are they Vila? Nick asked, slightly irritated at being interrupted from his magic memorizing. The man looked shocked. They are part Vila, how'd you know? He asked seriously. I have a passive bloodline trait that makes me hold dominion over all avian creatures, and as Vilas are part of that category, I imagine it's much like standing in the presence of your race's ruler. Before you ask, there is nothing I can do about it, so they will simply need to adapt to my presence. Nick explained honestly before going back to what he was doing. He didn't even feel like pointing out that as an all-female race, there was no such thing as part Vila. You either were or were not a Vila, there is no in between. 324. Chapter 324. The older man looked surprised at the answer for a moment before accepting it easily, as it not only explained what was happening, but was entirely possible with the vast potential of magic. "I do apologize for his rude manner of speaking, Mr. Delacour. You simply caught him while he was scoping out his competition," Dumbledore said with a chuckle. "Is he competing in the pageant?" The older man asked, surprised, since he had assumed it was Dumbledore that was participating. "Indeed he is. I dare say he has a strong chance of winning as well," the old goat said in a friendly manner. "As much as I would love to chat about this, I should probably go and calm down my family before they do something drastic," the older Delacour man said, before walking back to his family and explaining the situation. The Delacour family was a small but influential family that had their hands in quite a few French pies, as one of the oldest pureblood families in France. At the moment, it consisted of the grandparents, with the grandmother being considered half Vila by the wider world. The parents under that consisted of a single daughter and the son-in-law that were around the Weasley parents' age. And finally under that was the two daughters, with one being 15 and the other being 10. The eldest daughter was currently missing from the family here since she was a student at Beauxbatons, and the school's holiday break was the same as Hogwarts and thus hadn't started yet. Only the family members themselves, as well as those familiar with Vilas, knew that the women of the family weren't in fact human at all, but true Vila, hiding behind the lie to retain the privileges of wizards in the form of magical education and wand use. It was an international law that no magical race was permitted to own a wand under any circumstance, and so this lie was fiercely defended by the family. This made Nick's presence troubling to them, to say the least, as the women wanted nothing more than to kneel in front of him instinctually. They resisted the urge, of course, but it didn't make the situation any better for them at all. Sadly, they couldn't exactly chase him off without proper reason, as he was not doing anything wrong at all. The only method left to them was the most irritating one: grin and bear with it. The little girl of the family was the most uncomfortable, as she was having the hardest time out of them all controlling her impulses. Nick, meanwhile, was growing more and more irritated as time passed, while they waited in line, as the magic of the Velas was going out of control, and constantly trying to affect his mind to pay attention to them. A Vela's allure was a sort of compulsion magic that drew male attention to its owner, and despite being the magical equivalent of a king to avian creatures, Nick was still very much male. This meant the allure was battering against Sana, and his occlumency shields constantly like an alarm clock, going off no matter how many times he hits off. As a result, he was starting to lose his patience, which Dumbledore was the first to notice from the barely contained magical energy he sensed. Realizing that Nick was getting close to exploding in anger, Dumbledore quickly cast an isolation spell on him that cut off the allure affecting him. While this also cut Nick off from copying the magical effects of the wizard and witch's magical items, it still let him calm down. Having the allure cut off, however, made the Delacour women flinch slightly, as the magic was intrinsically part of themselves, and thus it stung to get it cut like that. The family didn't say anything, however, as it was fairly clear from the expression on Nick's face that they were irritating him with it. Thankfully, Dumbledore didn't need to maintain the isolation charm for much longer, as it was finally their turn to use the flu. Nick got hit with the allure for a brief moment again before they vanished from the ministry, but he ignored it. "I'll need to create something to keep that magic away from me if I want to get through the next 3 days without incident." Nick thought seriously as they finally stepped out of the fireplace and into Beauxbatons proper. He knew that the school was very big on style and beauty, but what he was met with was frankly speaking insane. The whole room they were in is covered in woven baby blue silk and gold tapestries, while the carpet was, and stone was magical beast fur, and marble with actual veins of gold running through it. 325. Chapter 325. This room was clearly a reception area, though, as there was no chairs or other furniture anywhere in it. There was a pair of double doors made of white oak that remained open and had 2 people waiting next to them. An extremely tall woman in a flowing black dress that had a collar of white fur. She had short, well-maintained brown hair and dark eyes, while her face bore a sort of warm, soft curvature to it that hid her age well. Nick knew who this woman was even without introduction, that to his knowledge from the books, Olympe Maxim, the headmistress of Beauxbatons. She smiled widely when she saw Dumbledore and walked over until she towered over both of them. "What a pleasant surprise we have here," she said happily, with a thick accent, while holding out her hand, which Dumbledore kissed politely on the knuckles. "It is always wonderful to see you, Olympe, though I must admit that I am not here to compete, but rather my student is instead," Dumbledore said with a smile. The large woman seemed taken back by this and finally turned her attention to Nick to get a good look at him. "Such a handsome young man, what marvelous air and eyes, golden-like." She froze mid-speech when the recognition of what his eyes were like sank in. "Like those of a phoenix, yes, and not without reason either. Nicholas here is quite loved by birds," Dumbledore said with a smile. "Nicholas Ravenclaw, Ringmaker." Nick introduced himself in French with a slight respectful bow. "Olympe Maxim, headmistress of Beauxbatons, and happy to make your acquaintance," she said warmly in French once he made it clear he spoke the language. Dumbledore clapped softly. "Now that introduction are finished, perhaps we had best move elsewhere lest we hold up the other visitors," he said warmly. "Aziz, Celeste can handle this, I am confident," the large woman said, and the middle-aged-looking French women, still at the doors, nodded. "Of course, madam. Please enjoy your conversation," she said in French. The headmistress then led Nick and Dumbledore away into the school grounds, outside the reception room. Rather than having the flue set up in the school itself, it was instead in a separate building just outside the school's protective wards. It was a smart placement, as it meant the school couldn't be invaded via the flue network. Beauxbaton's school grounds were much like those of Hogwarts, extremely spacious and filled with a picturesque scenery. The castle itself was old and richly designed with solid architecture, though the material composition seemed a bit gaudy in Nick's opinion, as white stone clashed hard with the otherwise green area. Much to his discomfort, though the majority of the grounds was covered by a very well-kept and vibrant floral garden. Nick may as well be a dwarf with how the only way he was truly comfortable was being surrounded by stone walls and metal tools. The half-giant noticed his discomfort immediately. "Is it not to your liking?" she asked, worried that there may be something off with the garden. Nick shook his head. "It's truly wonderful, but sadly I am personally more comfortable with stone and metal surrounding me. It's a crafter's curse, I'm afraid," Nick explained apologetically. "Ah, I understand." Did you know Nicholas Flamel himself has a similar problem? He's most comfortable when he has at least some sort of magical item with him, she said with a kind smile. Obviously, this conversation was happening in French, and despite speaking the language himself, Dumbledore was perfectly content merely listening. Nick smirked. "I imagine the man must have all sorts of bad habits after being alive for 600 years. He joked, and she laughed. "Oh yes, by far the worst has to be the way he drinks his coffee, black as night. He says he enjoys the bitterness of the drink, but I simply can't fathom why," she complains. "I prefer coffee with a bit of pure chocolate and almond cream, gives it a lovely sweetness and nutty aftertaste," Nick said, and her eyes lit up. "That does sound like a wonderful treat," she said with a smile. They continued chatting peacefully for a few moments as they walked through the gardens, and it became abundantly clear to Nick that she loved to talk. She didn't drone on or anything like that, but she clearly enjoyed holding a conversation about any topic she found interesting, gossip especially. Nick was more than happy to indulge her in that manner, as she was a font of interesting information once she got going. Sadly, all good thing must come to an end, and he felt the allure of Vilas tapping at his protections once again. 326. Chapter 326. This time the allure was much weaker than in the ministry, which made sense considering, unlike, then it is coming from a single person. Nick scowled as he turned to look at the source of the allure in the form of a blonde girl that was staring at him in confusion and anger. "Remove your magic," he commanded, having had enough of dealing with this allure. The girl stumbled, as she instinctively did, as he commanded, suffering from the backlash of it. Velas were able to suppress their allure to a degree, but never fully retract it normally, so it was foreign and painful for her when she did. "Fleur, are you all right?" Madame Maxim asked, concerned after seeing this happen. Fleur grit her teeth and glared at Nick. "What are you doing to me?" she hissed angrily. Nick scoffed. "I hold dominion over all avian creatures, and you are Vila. You exist under me in terms of hierarchy, so you feel suppressed naturally," he said calmly. "That's impossible." "I am no servant girl," she said defiantly. Nick shook his head at that, though it is not a matter of consent. All avian races are subserviently to me, and Vilas are no different, he said honestly. Fleur looked hateful. "That is unfair. Who gets to decide that?" she exclaimed angrily. "What are you talking about? Explain what is going on," Maxim demanded, unable to understand the situation. Dumbledore sighed, but explained Nick's unique nature in terms of avian creatures and how it creates a feeling of subservience to him, which Fleur was likely rejecting due to pride. "Perhaps it's best if you avoid him whilst he's here, my dear," the headmistress said, to try and help the situation. This was a very awkward situation for everyone involved, as neither side wanted to deal with the other because of factors out of both their controls. For Nick, it was the irritation that the allure caused, while for Fleur it was because of her nature clashing with her personality. She was a proud and powerful person and refused to bow her head to anyone, which clashed with her Vila instincts to do exactly that. Even worse was that she couldn't release her allure while in Nick's presence, since he had commanded her to remove it, causing her a lot of pain. She could only huff and leave in anger to escape the discomfort she was feeling. "I apologize for this situation. Had I any idea it would happen, I would have never brought him to compete in the pageant," Dumbledore said honestly with a deep bow. The half-giant shook her head with a sigh. "You could not have known," she said in a heavily accented English. "As for you, I hope you can forgive Fleur for her disrespect. This must have taken her by great surprise and angered her. She is quite prideful, so your ability must bother her greatly," Maxim said to Nick in French. He waved it off. "It's not like I will need to deal with her much in the future, so it doesn't matter to me how she thinks of me," he said honestly. She accepted that answer without any issue, since it was perfectly logical. "That reminds me, however, you never did say what you were using to compete, did you?" She changed the topic to one that she was interested in easily at that point. "I actually have two possible entries in the form of my familiar, Nazgul, and one of my companions, Dusk," Nick said with a smirk as he released both of them from his realm. The shift from lifeless and barren that was the realm to filled with life and color disoriented the two beasts. Madame Maxim, however, had her jaw drop in shock at what she saw. The first was an immortal bird native to Asia, while the other was an unknown creature that was very beautiful. "Dusk here is my companion and won't allow anyone to touch him. Nazgul, on the other hand, is my familiar and the first and only one of her kind, a ring beast. She will let you touch her, as she is quite friendly usually." Nick introduced the two creatures with a laugh. Dusk looked at the huge woman sternly after landing on Nick's shoulder, since he could tell that she was half giant like Hagrid. The gamekeeper had been quite insistent on trying to pet him despite getting bit more than once, which made the bird wary of large folk like him. Madame Maxim was not a simple-minded person like Hagrid, so when she got warned about not touching the bird, she knew better than to try and do so. Nazgul, on the other hand, was showered with affection that the spoiled creature accepted eagerly. 327. Chapter 327. Dumbledore and Nick were given a couple of rooms that the school reserved for important guests after that, while Nick was given access to the library after he asked. This first day was merely apportioned for guests to arrive, while the contest field was set up. As a result, Nick vanished into the library eagerly for the entire day, while Dumbledore spent the day chatting with Newt Scamander, who had shown up. The magizoologist was beyond excited to examine both Dusk and Nazgul while he was there, since the two creatures were allowed to roam freely by Madame Maxim. It was a rather entertaining scene to see the old researcher looking like an overexcited child as he looked over Nazgul. She absolutely loved the attention and was more than happy to let him pet her all over as he felt out her musculature and bone structure. Dusk, meanwhile, was straight murderous, looking for anyone that got curious about Nick in the library and tried to approach him. Unlike the library at Hogwarts, not only were the topics in Beauxbaton's library not restrictive in terms of topics, but it was also very well organized. The books were categorized, and sorted by topic, alphabetical order, difficulty, and even language. This made it easy for Nick to find a book on any topic he wanted to, which saved him a lot of time. Unfortunately, much like at Hogwarts, there was very few books on topics that interested him and weren't common. Nick had gotten so engrossed in reading that he didn't even notice when it was time for dinner and completely missed out on eating. He may have even missed sleep entirely had it not been for Dumbledore coming to figure out what was going on with him. Nick couldn't really be blamed for his zeal in this matter, as he had a mere 3 days to cram as much information as possible from this library into his head. In that time, he even needed to compete against others with Nazgul and Dusk, who was also allowed to participate by Madame Maxime, as an exception to the one-per-person rule. She didn't fail to make it clear that she mostly just wanted to see what fabulous clothes the two of them could inspire. Still, Nick reluctantly went to bed while abandoning his furious consumption of books, for now. The next day, he woke up bright and early and made nearly every student in the school, and most of the adults too, drop their jaws. He went to breakfast and ate enough food to easily fill a horse all without making even a little bit of a mess. It was the strangest sight for them, as he shoveled down food all while maintaining perfect manners. The only person in the entire room that ate as much as he did was the headmistress, that was a half-giant and required way more calories than a normal person. When asked about it, by her, Nick had no hesitation at all, transfiguring away his robe into shorts to reveal his well-developed physique before undoing the transfiguration. The entire school was left in a state of shock at that sight, as he was about as fit as possible for someone his age. No one doubted that his body likely required that much nutrition at that point, but was more interested in exactly how he gained a body like that. The older girls in the school were instead mostly fantasizing about what he would look like after a few more years, while the boys wanted to know what magic he used. Things got interesting, however, when the competition finally began, and each competitor set up a viewing stand for the magical creatures they brought. The first part of the competition was the appearance portion, in which cases the judges and spectators walked around the area and looked over the beasts. The regular participants for this annual event knew that there was actually a hidden judging part that secretly raised or lowered the judges' scores. This was the tameness level of the creatures in question that had specific people secretly antagonize the creatures to test their attitudes. The antagonizers for Dusk and Nazgul, however, didn't know whether to laugh or cry, as the beasts were so arrogant that they ignored them no matter what they said. Cursing, nitpicking, berating, absolutely nothing fazed the creatures at all. To be fair, though, the antagonizers weren't allowed to physically touch the creatures of the competition, or else they would have quickly learned that Dusk was not nearly as tame as he appeared. Still, the big bird quickly grew tired of entertaining these people by even looking at them, and went to sleep on Nick's shoulder. 328. Chapter 328. Nick was also fairly bored, since all he had to do for the pageant was sit in place, while the two beasts soaked up the attention. With that in mind, he had broke out his quill and a blank book that he started to write down his take on all the magical items he memorized yesterday. He, of course, labeled each individual item neatly, but the book quickly started to get covered in runes on both the front and backs of the pages. He frowned a bit after he finished the book, since he still had quite a few more enchantments to write down. He could only shrug and take out another blank book and continue after labeling the title as Part 2. He didn't notice it at first, since there was a bunch of different magical signatures around him, but one had stopped at his stand. It was a middle-aged-looking man with short brown hair and curious blue eyes that picked up the first book Nick had set down and was looking through it with interest. A little crude, but all these enchantments would certainly work, the man said with a smile as he put the book down. Nick looked up from the second book at this time and immediately paled at what his magical senses were telling him. This person was old, like really old, and powerful to boot. This person's magical energy was between Dumbledore and Slytherin, with a heavy inclination towards the latter's power level. Nicholas Flamel, I take it. Nick quickly recovered and asked politely. The man was taken back by this question for a moment before laughing and nodding his head with a look of understanding. You have magical sight, or is it hearing? No need to answer, I prefer to figure it out myself. Those are the only way you could have seen through my disguise after all. If it's not too troublesome, can you tell me what specifically gave me away? The man spoke calmly and with a burning curiosity. Nick smiled bitterly. I hadn't expected that one of my secrets would be seen through just from exposing you. It was both your age as well as your mana level that exceeded even that of Dumbledore that gave you away, he said honestly, since there was no point in lying. The man before him was an ancient wizard with all the knowledge that may come from such a long lifespan, because unlike most wizards, he loved research and learning new things. Few could understand the implications behind that, but Nick was very much aware of what it meant. It means that despite having less mana than Slytherin, he had so much more knowledge and skill that he could very likely toss the founder around without much effort. Nicholas Flamel was a magical juggernaut, and everyone knew it. That was why no one dared to try and directly steal from the man or attack him. Ah, yes, that would certainly do it. I hadn't expected to meet someone with your rare gift and neglected to hide those. While I can't remove my disguise for understandable reasons, I suppose introductions are in order. Nicholas Flamel, alchemist. Flamel said with a slight bow. Nicholas Ravenclaw, ringmaker. Nick said, returning the bow. I have been rather curious about you for quite some time, little fellow. You can then, of course, imagine my delight to find you visiting my alma mater with my student and friend. Flamel said, while wandlessly conjuring a chair to sit in. You said my rune sentences were crude. Why? Nick asked while pointing at the book. Not crude as in incorrect as each rune, and even the sentence structure is flawless. However, you wrote them like you were talking or holding a conversation. Runes were never meant to be used in that manner. They were designed to cause complex things with simply concepts. Take wands, for example. You only need 3 or 4 runes to create a working wand, but adding more rarely makes the finished product better. Complex enchantments like this need merely a handful of carefully chosen words alongside the correct will while engraving them to function. The old alchemist said, and Nick understood what he meant. So I've been looking at runes wrong this entire time then, he said with a disappointed sigh. No, child, not wrong, but skewed instead. It was like you were looking at the subject with only a single eye. The image you received was not wrong, but incomplete, off if you would. What is most impressive is that you clearly didn't learn runes in a traditional manner, as this is a simple and basic thing taught in the class. The old alchemist said with a smile. 329. Chapter 329. Now that's a face I haven't seen in many years, Dumbledore said with nostalgia as he walked up. I can only think of a single person who may take on that visage whilst in my presence. It is good to see you, Nico. He spoke warmly. Albus I was just helping this child understand a flaw in his understanding of runes. It is quite impressive what he has achieved without proper guidance in this matter, you know. Flamel said with a wide smile. Dumbledore chuckled. Always the teacher, old friend? He asked jokingly. Flamel shrugged. I always find that it helps to refresh my knowledge by teaching others. To be fair, though, there is clearly not much that this young man needs to learn on the topic, as he clearly has a firm grasp of the language. See for yourself. Flamel said, while pointing at the book on the table. Dumbledore picked it up and skimmed through it with a surprised look. If the basics weren't clearly skewed, I would almost think that you wrote this, Nico. It is a very good compendium of enchantments beyond the unnecessary complexity, he said honestly with a sigh. My thoughts exactly, Flamel said in happy agreement. Might I ask why you're writing this, as I doubt you have much need for such a thing with your enchantment method? Dumbledore asked curiously while setting the book on the table. I was going to create a copy of it before giving it to my 2 friends that are studying runes as a Christmas gift. Nick explained, since he had no reason to lie. According to Phileas, that is Miss Granger and Miss Greengrass correct. The old goat confirmed, and Nick nodded. After a revision into the proper rune format, I believe it would be a fine book for learning from. I do hope I can convince you to add a copy to the library as well, Dumbledore said honestly. I'm flattered, but it's not something that deserves to be added to a school library like the one at Hogwarts. None of the enchantments even have a description of what they do, Nick said honestly. While I can agree that it would be a poor choice for an amateur to pick up, but for an inexperienced but knowledgeable individual, It is an excellent teaching text, as it contains every level of enchantment, from simple to complex. Flamel disagreed with Nick. Rather than arguing with someone who clearly knew better than him, Nick said that he would consider the matter. Flamel stayed to chat for about an hour before leaving with a promise to visit at a later date, when things weren't so busy. The day's portion of the pageant ended shortly after that, with a score assigned to each magical beast that had been present. The judges were quite professional, as they even scored the obvious joke creatures that Nick had seen previously. While both Dusk and Nazgul had a similar score, Nazgul won out slightly, thanks to her friendly demeanor compared to Dusk's angry, mean one. The next day's pageant part was basically a catwalk where the bests got to show off their abilities and move around so everyone could see all of them. There was extra points if the beast was dangerous, but under control. Nick found that part rather funny, as Nazgul could directly attack and consume souls, while Dusk was a powerful immortal bird. In the Ministry's classification, Dusk was an XXXXX class dangerous creature, and Nazgul had no classification for now, so the danger was definitely present. Still, that was a matter for tomorrow as far as Nick was concerned, while the library was a matter for today. He was more than eager to dive back into the treasure trove of knowledge set before him. He was not surprised at all to see several tomes written by Nicholas Flamel himself on various topics, considering the man had a particular fondness for the school as a graduate. Despite this, Nick made sure that the only topics he read books on while he was here as those that were rare and little known. For example, he found tomes on flight magic, veritology, rituals, spatial magic, and even alchemy that were hard to find normally. The books on flight magic helped him greatly with his understanding of the topic despite, once again, not having any complete magics on it. The veritology books were mostly on more exotic materials, and how wands used to be made before the industry standardized the procedure. The rituals mostly covered the same kinds as the books in Hogwarts, so he only skimmed them. Spatial magic, though, was a stupidly complex matter that gave Nick a headache as he copied the 2 books he found. 330. Chapter 330. Alchemy was far more abundant in terms of books, thanks to Nicholas Flamel's favoritism, but was a confusing subject, to say the least. There was actually a few schools of thought involved in the subject that all alchemy fell under. The first was transmutation, or the changing of one thing into another permanently. This was accomplished in a few different ways, but the final result always requires the alchemist to exchange something of equal worth for the change. Usually this is in the form of mana, but it was possible to substitute other things. The second school of thought was the displacement school that sought to give magical abilities to an object that the object normally wouldn't have. Things got weird at this point, as you could, in theory, give even a simple pebble the ability to kill a guard if you were able to trade the price required for it. Alchemy worked based on the principle of equivalent exchange. After all, however, so the price of such a thing was horribly high. This school of alchemy, though, had heavy use of ritual circles and heavy material costs that changed in a way that left the alchemist needing to set up the magic from scratch every single time. The second to last school of alchemy was the life school, and was where things got very messy and dark very fast. The ultimate goal of this school was to create the supreme creature that was perfect in every way. Almost every alchemist in this school was a vile dark wizard or witch, as the easiest way to conduct experiments in this school was on living or unborn creatures by fusing external pieces onto them or altering them before birth. This was how an extremely large amount of monstrous magical creatures came about, and as such was almost outright banned globally. Nick copied the information on the subject, but knew he was very unlikely to ever use it. The final school of alchemy was the emotion or soul school, and focused on giving emotions or true souls to their creations. This school was the most esoteric of all the schools, as it was so difficult to progress, in that not even Nicholas Flamel wrote much on it beyond the barest hint of the starting point. This starting point was creating enchantments via one's own emotions to fulfill a need, which was extremely powerful magic, considering the protection granted to Harry from his mother fell into this school. It was thanks to all this information on alchemy that Nick could roughly figure out how Nicholas Flamel managed to create the Philosopher's Stone. See, the great alchemist was born just before the Black Plague ran rampant across Europe, and while he may not have created the disease, he probably used the life force and deaths of the victims to create the stone, as that would be the only way it could allow it to do what it does. It explained why no one else had managed to create a stone in this long period of time since that point. Flamel had likely marked the disease so that each of its victims fueled his alchemical construct at the moment of their deaths. As more and more lives were lost, the stone gained greater and greater power until the disease finally was stomped out. By that point, though the stone had the sacrificed power of between 50 to 75 million people killed by the disease. So much power was still not enough to give immortality via life extension, but it certainly gave a very large increase of maybe a few thousand years. It was likely what the elixir of life actually was pure life force distilled into liquid form that likely removed the effects of aging or injury on the body. Nick didn't think any lower of the great alchemist despite figuring it out, as what he did, while certainly not righteous, was also not evil, merely opportunistic. More than likely, the way Flamel saw it was that since these people were going to die either way, he might as well use them for his own benefit. While a callous way of looking at it to modern folk, it should be pointed out that this was also a time when Muggles actively hunted magical folk down. It was already good enough that Flamel hadn't made the disease way worse to squeeze out some extra profit. Still, it was getting late, and Nick knew he was going to participate in the final stint of the pageant the next day, and finished copying the information down before heading for the dining hall. He didn't need to worry about feeding Dusk or Nazgul while he was here, as the school had provided food for them generously. 331. Chapter 331. Nick got gawked at while he ate again, but he ignored that in favor of indulging his hunger. After that, he turned in for the night content with his gains while he was here. He woke up nice and early the next day and tidied up the room he was in, since he wouldn't be returning to it at the end of the day. He walked through the halls of Beauxbatons while admiring the details of the castle. Hogwarts was grand, and all but in terms of details, it was fairly lacking, since the focus was mostly on pragmatism. Beauxbatons, on the other hand, clearly placed heavily emphasis on beauty and art, as the halls were adorned with any statues, paintings, and expensive but pretty materials like gold-veined marble. This wasn't to say that the wards protecting the school weren't extremely powerful, merely that the look of the place was different. There weren't many people up at this time, so Nick went fairly unnoticed as he strolled through the hallways. The few people who did notice him wisely decided that they wanted nothing to do with the large, unreasonably angry-looking bird on his shoulder. Nick had long given up on improving Dusk's attitude and mostly ignored the fear he caused as a result. So long as no one tried to touch the bird, he was actually fairly harmless, as he didn't go picking fights for no reason. He was far too arrogant for such a thing after all. As it turned out, however, Newt Scamander was also an early riser, and unlike everyone else knew that he had nothing to fear from the bird. "Ah, Mr. Ravenclaw, just the person I was hoping to bump into," the older man said warmly as he spotted Nick in the hallway. "Can't imagine you'd have much reason to see me besides my familiar or Dusk here." Nick said, slightly confused. He honestly had no reason that he could think of as to why the magizoologist would want to see him other than the beast he kept in his company. He had already passed all the information he had on the celestial bird the last time they spoke, so it couldn't be that. "I actually had an offer for you, in fact, that I thought might interest you given your unique situation. You see, I happened to be visiting an old friend in the form of a thunderbird over the summer, and was wondering if you might be interested in meeting him," Newt asked with a smile. Nick was taken back by this question, as he hadn't even thought about it despite knowing that Newt once had a thunderbird in his possession. "I wouldn't mind meeting such a creature myself, but I doubt I'll have the time, unfortunately. I am under a rather heavy time crunch to improve my abilities and simply can't relax for any real period of time," Nick said with an apologetic sigh. Newt was surprised and furrowed his brows. What could be so important as to have a child like yourself under so much pressure? he asked, concerned. I may have offended Voldemort quite heavily, and he also may have recently been resurrected, Nick said casually. Newt's jaw practically hit the floor at this, which was to be expected, considering the nature of the information. Surely, Dumbledore would not allow a child to be dragged into a matter like this and would protect you, Newt questioned in disbelief. In a normal situation that would be true. Unfortunately, the situation is far from normal. Nick then explained the pressure the old goat was under as well as his own exemption from classes and the reasons for it. Basically, it boiled down to the old man being far too busy to help Nick actively, so he was basically given free reins to improve and protect himself to the best of his ability. Newt could only sigh in resignation that Nick truly was under a serious time crunch, and indeed had no time for a relaxing trip to the States to see a Thunderbird. With that matter truly settled, Newt could only change the topic to Nazgul to raise his mood. It was a rather interesting conversation for Nick, as the magizoologist knew his field well, and pointed out a few of the strange features she had. Things like the clear serpentine neck and head that resembled a basilisk, suspiciously closely to even how she had features from both phoenixes as well as thunderbirds. The thing that seemed to confuse Newt the most about her, however, was the ring at the end of her tail that seemed to serve no actual purpose beyond appearances. Nick had to explain how Nazgul was born for Newt to understand why that existed, but that information only gave the man even more questions. 332. Chapter 332. Newt bombarded Nick with various strange questions for the next 30 minutes until it was finally time for breakfast, at which point he reluctantly left. While Nick didn't mind sharing what he knew of Nazgul with the man, he had trouble keeping up with some of the questions. For example, Newt asked how many feathers she had as if it was a totally normal thing to sit down and count them. Sure, Nick understood that the man was being thorough, but this was plain weird. Breakfast went much like the previous 2 meals, with Nick eating a large sum of food before leaving for the pageant area. The area had been changed from the sort of fairish-like setup to a wide open field with various objects and walkways throughout it. Nick merely needed to look over each of the objects to figure out what they were used for. They were certainly thorough with the tests they set up. He thought, impressed. It was very comprehensive, as there were 7 different types of strength testers, speed testers, magical ability testers, and various miscellaneous other tools for testing unique aspects. All in all, the competition was about as fair as possible at this stage for judging the best beast. Nick took his time explaining how each of the pieces of equipment worked to Nazgul and Dusk, as well as which ones they would be using. There wasn't a piece of equipment for testing soul-based attacks, but that was fine for Nick, since he didn't want to publicize that ability of Nazgul's. The shows of power that Dusk was going to do was its firepower, strength, speed, and aerial prowess. For Nazgul, it was a bit more complex, as she had far more abilities than any of the immortal birds, as she had teleportation, super strength, special fire, regular fire, soul attacking and devouring, flight, basilisk eyes, and high intelligence. She may also even have the rebirth ability of the immortal birds, or perhaps might just be inherently immortal. Nick had to admit that his familiar was nearly as crazy to quantify as himself in terms of abilities, and almost certainly many times more powerful. Nazgul was strange in that regard, as she actually had no more magical power than a wizarding owl, yet was a spiritual juggernaut in terms of spiritual energy. To explain, it would be like comparing Slytherin's mana to Ran's. It was incomparable larger and more potent. This led to a rather funny loophole in the amount of power a creature could have on Earth at the moment due to the low mana levels. As Nazgul's main source of power wasn't mana, she was not really limited in how powerful she could get, and as a result was likely the most powerful thing on the planet in an unsealed state. Thankfully, she was very gentle and lazy most of the time, so was no real threat, unless somehow pissed off, which hadn't happened yet. All of the participants for the pageant were given a badge with a number on it to show them when they could come out onto the field and show off their beast's abilities. Nick was the only participant given 2 badges due to having 2 different beasts competing in the pageant. For Dusk, he had the number 34, and for Nazgul the number 104, which was towards the end of the pageant. It was at this time that the participants got to finally see who the judges were, since they were hidden in the previous part. Madame Maxime, Dumbledore, Martin Dumont, Apolline Delacour, and Newt Scamander made up the judges and were sitting comfortably at a table chatting. Nick could feel his eyebrow twitch at the line up, as at least 3 of the 5 judges were people he has interacted with to a slightly personal degree in some manner. Dumbledore is in almost constant contact with him. Newt was in love with magical creatures, and thus eagerly chatted and felt comfortable around Nick, and Apolline Delacour was a Veela, and thus subject to his avian dominion. The only true neutral judges were Madame Maxime and Martin Dumont. Martin Dumont was an interesting individual to have as a judge in this competition, considering his expertise was in dueling. In fact, during the height of Voldemort's reign years back, the man was the 3-time champion of the global dueling tournament. The best part, though, was that the man had a raging hatred for the Death Eaters under Voldemort after they stole his infant child to use as blackmail, but ended up killing it. There was no evidence found, but the 3 Death Eaters responsible went missing a year after that incident, and all fingers pointed at this man. 333. Chapter 333. The man was a well-known gruff and impatient individual, so it came as quite the surprise that he was judging a pageant of all things. Nick could understand roughly how this judge's table had been created, and found it most probable that it was mostly Madame Maxime's doing. She likely used her authority as the head mistress of the school hosting this event to get Dumbledore on the table, and the rest were either well known for magical beasts or were friends of hers. Nick decided to ignore this, though, since the competition itself didn't interest him all that much. Anyway this event turns out, he will have accomplished his goal of publicizing Nazgul to the world. Winning was merely a bonus at this point in time, so he was not bothered by any part of the pageant anymore. Each numbered badge was called in order, and the participants each took to the field with their beast to strut their stuff. The only interesting creature before dusk belonged to the 12th numbered badge, and came in the form of a horned water snake that arrogantly showed off in the field. The species was well known for their foresight ability that made them very hard to find, as they saw you coming before you ever got near them. The species as a whole was dark blue and about as thick as a bucket, and nearly 20 feet long on average. They got their name from the bodies of water they made their homes, along with the long curved horn on their heads. To even see one was rare, but the owner of this particular member of the species, that was a woman with her face covered, clearly had it as her familiar from how close she appeared with it. What left Nick surprised, however, was that the woman spoke in Parseltongue to the serpent. This was also a point of interest for everyone else, as well as the gift was very rare, with only India having a fairly large population of users for it. Unlike in Europe, Parseltongue was a revered ability to have in India, and was mostly used by healers and sages. I wonder if she naturally has the ability, or if she got it from her familiar. Nick wondered curiously. That is how familiar bonds normally worked after all, as the familiar passing some abilities to their partner, and vice versa. Nick and Nazgul were unique in that most of her abilities came from him, and he got almost nothing from her, since he was both her creator and partner. Nick knew he had received something from her through their bond, but other than a slight increase in spiritual power, he had no idea what. He tried the whole basilisk eyes thing, but that was a dud, and even the whole soul-eating thing wasn't it either. He also couldn't turn into lightning to teleport. He tried really hard on that one. Besides the brief glance he received from the woman after Dusk's number was called, Nick did not interact with her at all, since he had no real reason to. Dusk didn't need Nick to tell him what to do once they were out on the field, and began to show off his prowess. It probably didn't need to be stated, but Dusk going all out with his fire and strength was an awe-inspiring sight. The bird casually lifted quarter-ton weighs and flew around with them for a minute before putting them down. After that, it erupted in flame in the special fire-resistant area and bathed the whole field in scorching heat as he went all out. Immortal birds were not a joke when they wanted to show their power, as each one of them could cause considerable damage if they wished to. Thunderbirds could cause a hurricane filled with copious amounts of lightning on a whim. Ho-hos summoned fierce flames like those of the sun and phoenixes, could teleport via flame, and had strong fire manipulation powers. Once Dusk's performance was complete, they left the field to quite a lot of applause. The woman with the horned water snake seemed to be sizing them up at that point, but Nick ignored it as she wasn't alone. Quite a few participants were doing the same either out of fear, intrigue, and concern, but all eyes were on Nick and Dusk. The pageant went on after that, and Nazgul left more than a few jaws on the ground with her performance. It didn't come as much of a surprise that she ended winning by a landslide as she ticked all the right boxes. Beauty, grace, power, temperament, and uniqueness. She had all of that in spades. 334. Chapter 334. The prize for winning wasn't anything all that special for Nick, as it was merely a few hundred galleons and a spot in the global newspapers, the later of which interested him the most as it fixed the issue he may have with taking Nazgul traveling. Dusk actually wasn't even in the top 5, since his temperament caused his final score to drop a lot. He was a very angry bird, and it showed in the way he acted at all times. Nick was pretty sure that Dumbledore had a hand in the sharpness of the hit his points took, though. Dusk didn't actually care about the matter, and only participated since it helped Nick ingratiate himself with the headmistress. A well-earned success, Monsieur Ravenclaw. The little one is simply such a treat to have around that it pains me to see her leave. Alas, she is your familiar, and thus nothing I can say would tempt you to give her over to me. Madame Maxim says in French on the way back to the Flu building to see Nick and Dumbledore off. I imagine you'll have the opportunity to see her at a later date. Nick said with a grin. I will hold you to that, young man, she said with a smile. As much as we have all enjoyed these last few days, it is time to depart for now. Please do take care of yourself, Olymp. The world is a dangerous place these days, after all. Dumbledore said before he and Nick left for the Ministry, as they had to take yet another flew back to the British Isles. The Ministries didn't waste their time and had them sent over quickly, since Dumbledore was not the sort of person you tried to hold up with nonsense. Will you be staying at Hogwarts for the holidays? The old goat asked once they stepped out of the Flu in his office. Nick nodded. I'll be busy in the next few weeks working out how to fix the broken magic in Professor Lupin, and will have little time for relaxation, he said seriously. Also, do keep in mind that whatever I come up with simply won't be possible to mass produce, so for the rest of the werewolves, it would be better to try and devise a animagi reversal ritual to strip the curse from them, he added before leaving the office. Dumbledore could only sigh after hearing that, as he wanted to get to work on exactly such a thing, but simply lacked the time for it these days. Perhaps Minerva would help Remus with this. The old man pondered to himself. Nick meanwhile let both Dusk and Nazgul out of his realm, since they were back at Hogwarts, and did not need to be confided any more. He knew that while they weren't uncomfortable in the realm, that they hated how small it was. Nick had a plan to fix that here soon, but for now there was little he could do about it. Heading to the workshop, Nick was greeted to a strange sight along the way. Fred and George were walking around disguised as snowmen to prank anyone they could with it. Nick looked over the illusion spell they had used for this, and nodding happily at what he found. It was clear to him that the twins had taken his disdain for the illusion they used at the time personally, and improved their illusion magic skills. Say what you want about the twins, but they weren't stupid by any means, and were actually very talented wizards that simply didn't like doing boring activities. To be fair, no one usually did, but most people sucked it up rather than ignore the punishments and do the bare minimum while focusing their energy on something else like the twins. The teaching staff have made their disappointment in the twins' wasting of talent very clear. Nick didn't think they were wasting their talent at all, but rather focusing it on what they enjoyed instead, which was jokes. Calidum pedis, Nick said, and watched as the twins started jumping around like they were standing barefoot on a hot surface. The heart feet charm was actually harmless, but it made the victim think they were burning their souls so long as they had their feet on the ground. Ha 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 ha! Nick burst into laughter at the sight, as it was ironic to see a pair of snowmen with burning feet. The twins also laughed, since they knew they had beheaded good. Nick removed the charm on them with a smirk. It looks like a little heat wasn't enough to melt these snowmen, Maybe I should use some fire this time. He pondered out loud before puffing out a small amount of azure flame from his nose with a wide grin. 335. Chapter 335. Wicked, the twins exclaimed at the same time when they saw the flames. How'd you do that without a spell, mate? One of the twins asked curiously. It's a secret, Nick said with a teasing smile. Well, that's no fun at all, they complained loudly. Nick chuckled. So what sort of mischief have you two been up to? Anything good? He asked with interest. They shook their heads, the usual japes and pranks on the unsuspecting, I'm afraid. Business has been a bit slow, what with the holidays coming up, you know how it is. One of them said, and Nick nodded in understanding. Christmas was usually a peaceful and joyous time in the Isle, so few people would have an interest in the high energy of mischief at this time. I'll let you two get back to it then, he said, and bid them farewell as he left. The workshop was empty when he got there, which he had already expected. Entering his realm, Nick started to analyze the samples he had taken from Lupin a few days ago. Until now, they had been kept fresh via a stasis field, so he had no trouble at all spotting the difference between them. The hair samples were mostly unchanged from the transformation, which was to be expected considering the stuff was dead material to begin with. The blood and skin samples, on the other hand, showed drastic changes in both form and function. The skin, for example, had a very well-hidden protective magical enchantment on each cell that was impossible to notice in the unchanged cells. This was clearly where the resistance to spells that werewolves had came from, but what made Nick irritated was that he could tell that this magic was added to the lycanthropy curse later due to the differing styles it had. Alchemist of the Life School experimented on werewolves in the past, it seems. That complicates things a bit since I now need to make even more changes to the magic now. Nick thought, irritated. The blood samples, though, left him frustrated at the changes between the regular and transformed cells. The regular blood cells behaved normally and weren't of much note, while the transformed cells were completely different than the normal ones. They were more active, held much more oxygen, and highly cancerous. No wonder werewolves don't usually live to old age. They suffer the damage of stage 4 cancer 3 nights a month. Even the strong vitality of the curse can only barely keep them stable, but the damage probably stacks up over time until their bodies collapse on themselves. How pitiful, Nick thought with a frown. Just looking over these samples told him what sort of horrible experience it must be to be stricken with the curse. Shorter life expectancy, agony once a month, social stigma, and the constant worry about infecting others. It was nightmarish to say the least, and Nick knew that he would want to fix this problem had he not needed all the time possible to improve himself and complete his missions. Once he was done with the biological samples, he moved on to the ring that recorded the life force of its wearer for a period of time. In this case, it was before, during, and after Lupin transformed, so he could actively see what changes occurred during this time. He started the playback of the ring, while the realm analyzed it in detail from start to finish. Once it was done, the realm manifested an illusionary image of the entire recorded life force. It looked quite a bit like a bright red aurora floating in the air with various complex shapes and designs in it much like runes, but not at the same time. Nick couldn't translate them since they weren't an actual language, but he didn't need to either. This data was used to see what changed during the process so that he could focus on figuring out those parts specifically. The lycanthropy curse was easily the most complex piece of magic he had ever seen, and as a result, correcting its flaws was an equally if not harder task than just outright blocking the transformation. Normally, he wouldn't waste his time and just create a ring to stop Lupin from transforming, but he needed a lot of data to successfully modify his own animagus ritual, and the information he was receiving would help him greatly. In addition, he really wanted that Deidre heart that the mission would give him if he fixed the lycanthropy curse. He even knew what the best possible use for the heart would be too, and it had him very eager. 336. Chapter 336. Nick shook his head to rid himself of these thoughts as he commanded the realm to slowly play the recording while studying each and every spot on the image for even the smallest of changes. At first, he thought that the curse somehow avoided altering the life force during the transformation, But then he spotted the first change. A tiny, seemingly inconsequential part of the image morphed from its original shape to a twisted and strange, one of a different color. From there on, more and more changes started to appear one after the other until they numbered in the thousands. Even in such a large number, these changes barely registered more than 2% of the entire life force, which should demonstrate just how many details made up the life force of a person. 81,523 points of change spread throughout the entire life force. This is gonna take a while, Nick thought with a sigh before getting to work. Each symbol in the life force was a simply thing much like a gear that needed many, many other parts to truly show its value. This thankfully made it a fairly easy matter to try and figure out what specifically they were part of. Most of the parts changed by the curse were in regards to the shape and function of the cells in the body, that when compounded with the ones that dictated the shape of the body, created the life force of a werewolf. These changes were not permanent thanks to the life force being built to find parts of itself not mixing well with the others and repairing them. These changes only last during the full moon, likely because that is the only time that the lunar energy is the highest, and after that the curse lacks the power to maintain these changes, so the werewolf transforms back into a normal person. Nick theorized. It explained why such a powerful magic might fail to be active constantly, which would make werewolves a lost cause, and need them to be killed to stop the spread. I wonder, if I were to collect the light of the moon and present it to Lupin, would he immediately transform or not? Nick thought, and immediately decided to test it. Saving the data he had received in the realm in a special memory vial, he left the realm. Tempus, he said, while waving his wand to get the time at the moment. 7:35. I have time to collect some light before I ought to get some sleep, he thought before leaving the workshop and heading for the courtyard, since the astronomy tower was definitely being used at the moment. The courtyard, on the other hand, was probably very much empty. Most people wouldn't even consider being out there at night during winter from the sheer level of cold that they would be exposed to needlessly. Nick was not most people, however, and easily shrugged off the cold with a warming charm before he left the castle. The moon was waning away from full on this day, so while not as good as during a full moon, he could still collect the light in abundance. After setting a quick alarm around him in case someone came, Nick closed his eyes and extended his senses, as per the method he had. Once he saw the light, he quickly and firmly began to weave the hand signs that drew out the light. Threads of magic came from his hands in an invisible manner that he could only see, thanks to his current extended senses. It merely took him 5 minutes to extract a basketball-sized chunk of light material, thanks to his constant replenishment of mana with every breath. This constant region of energy meant he could actively pour more energy into the magic without worrying about running out. It was still a heavily energy-consuming task, but at least he could speed it up a little now. Once he was done, Nick removed his alarm and headed back into the castle for the night. He headed straight up to the common room to wait at that point, since dinner should be reaching its end, and he didn't want to be woken up. The next day he woke up at dawn like usual and got dressed while casting a warming charm on himself to ward off the chill of the cold that had seeped into the dorm. It wasn't frigid by any means, but still less than optimal for a heat-driven creature like himself. The common room was not much better since the fire had gone out in the fireplace some time during the night, so he placed a few more logs in from the pile next to the fireplace and lit them with a small jet of azure flames from his mouth. 337. Chapter 337. Nick had to admit he absolutely loved this ability, even though it didn't have much use to him. He was pretty sure it was the fascination with dragons that everyone has when they are young, and I haven't seen one before. No matter how fierce or hideous the creatures are called by others, to a child dragons are plain cool. It's just how they were hardwired for some reason. That changed when the child grew up most of the time, or in the wizarding community's case, actually saw a real dragon up close. It's rather hard to idolize something when it is actively trying to kill you. Not impossible, of course, but still difficult. Nick was no different really, as despite seeing Norbiter up close, the dragon whelp didn't exactly frighten Nick with its constant avoidance of him. Still, the ability to breath fire was awesome, and Nick refused to think otherwise. With the fireplace filled with a roaring fire, warmth quickly returned to the common room and the dorms connected to it. Nick didn't stick around, however, and made his way to the workshop to work on his Christmas gifts. Lupin had classes today. That meant he was going to be unavailable until they were over, giving Nick about 4 hours to kill. He didn't go to breakfast, but ate some Lember's bread instead, like he had found himself doing more and more recently. He couldn't help it, since he was really on a tight time crunch to improve and complete several things all at once. He wasn't planning on getting everyone expensive or amazing gifts this year, as there was no point. Everyone who got a gift from him got a personalized gift based on them, but there was no reason it had to be over the top. For example, Hermione and Daphne were getting 2 hand-written books of nothing, but enchantments which they will undoubtedly use over the break. For Ron, he had a book on veritology he copied from Beauxbatons, since the craft was his passion at the moment. Harry was getting the dagger made from sunlight Nick made previously. Tracy was getting a furnace with a cold fire seed and dragon flame seed pre-installed that he ordered secretly through the twins. It was a larger furnace, however, as he noticed she was more inclined to the pointy life, taking implements rather than jewelry like him. There was nothing wrong with that at all, since most craftsmen had a thing they were best at or focused their attention on. A good example of this was that Snape was able to brew almost any potion, but preferred instead to improve on those that already existed. For Luna, he was actually a little bothered, as he didn't know what specifically to get her, as she had a very eclectic set of preferences that covered a great many topics. In the end, he settled for whatever a chunk of moonlight would become, since it was a gift based on her name. A bit lazy, perhaps, but it was the best he could come up with on short notice. Nick was thankful that the light of the moon wasn't actually the same as its actual light. None of the light he collected was. It was simply magical energy saturated with that celestial object's influence condensed into a solid material. Even calling it light was scientifically incorrect, as it had absolutely nothing to do with actual light. Anyways, the stuff had an inclination for jewelry inherently, which was great, as he managed to condense a fist-sized chunk of it into a bracelet with a shiny, glowing silver color and small white stones dotting it. The effect of the bracelet was most surprising, as it granted a chameleon ability to whoever wore it that reminded Nick suspiciously of the Metamorphagus gift. It was weak, though, so it only allowed small changes like hair length, nose size, lip fullness, that sort of thing. It was an odd ability that fit Luna like a glove, making it perfect. All he had left at this point was gift-wise was the professors, Sirius, and the twins. Nick didn't have a very wide group that he regularly interacted with, so his list of people was still manageable. He put that off for later, though, as classes finally ended, and it was now time for him to test his theory on lunar energy. Lupin was not expecting Nick to show up today. How could he, considering the difficulty of the task he was working on? He was left even more dumbfounded when Nick started to explain why he was there, as well as what he had learnt. These were groundbreaking discoveries in lycanthropy research, but Nick didn't seem to care at all and was insistent on testing a theory he came up with. 338. Chapter 338. It would be best if we speak to Dumbledore on this matter first, just in case this test of yours goes sideways. Lupin said seriously, after he calmed himself to think rationally. If he were younger, he may have agreed to the test outright, eagerly, without thinking about how it could go wrong. But after a life full of regrets brought about by doing exactly that, he had learnt self-restraint the hard way. Nick frowned, since he didn't want to bring the old goat into the matter, but he could agree that Lupin also had a point. He was using a fairly unknown form of magic in order to try and stimulate the werewolf curse in Lupin, so it was possible that the test would cause an unforeseen complication to appear. Fine, then. We will speak to Dumbledore about this before deciding to push the test forward, Nick said in agreement. They left the office quickly after that and immediately headed to the headmaster's office, since neither thought Dumbledore would mind the interruption, considering the nature of it. They were right as well, since the old man was expecting such an event to happen during the course of Nick's study on the topic. Fill me in on what you have discovered so far before we discuss the matter of this test you wish to perform. the old man said seriously. Nick honestly explained the details of what he had discovered from the samples he had taken from Lupin previously, as well as his theory on why the curse only activated on the 3 days of the full moon. Some of what he talked about confused Lupin greatly, but Dumbledore seemed to understand what he was referring to. It's clear to me that you have been quite thorough in your research on the topic. To the point, in fact, that you may be the only person with this deep of an understanding of the curse in the entire world. It is also my understanding that the light you collected from the moon is the purest condensed magic of it. Is that correct? Dumbledore spoke softly, but with a seriousness that made it hard to lie. Nick nodded. That was why I wanted to see if my lunar energy theory was true. Of course, the professor here will at most be exposed to a very small amount of the material, so if he transforms it is only for a short period, he said reassuringly. Dumbledore nodded. Very well then, you may give him the material while I watch on from the side, he said, and stood up from his chair before holding his wand at the ready. Lupin looked nervous as Nick took the globe of material from his ring and carefully pinched off a tiny portion. The rest was placed within his realm again before Nick dropped the material into Lupin's hand. Immediately the material looked like it sank into his skin, but they all knew what really happened. The curse ate the energy. Lupin groaned for a moment as the curse started its activation pattern, but he stopped shortly afterwards when the jolt of lunar energy ran out and the curse was suppressed by his body again. All three of their eyes lit up at this as they understood that Nick's theory was correct and that the lunar energy merely served as fuel for the curse to be active. This meant that there was now a very easy solution to the problem that all werewolves faced. All that was needed was a way to protect their bodies from the lunar energy, and they would simply never transform again. It wasn't exactly a cure for the curse, but it was a far better method of treatment than the newly created Wolf's Bane potion that only allowed them to retain their minds after transforming to a degree. The way it did this, however, was no better than eating poison to fight a disease, as the potion poisoned the wolf side of the werewolves, thus letting the human mind remain for the most part. That makes me wonder how the curse absorbs the energy exactly. Is it passive through the body, or does it actively take it in? Nick pondered out loud, making Lupin nervous. It should be pointed out that Nick looked almost excited at the idea of testing this out in much the same way a mad scientist would. Perhaps it's best if we leave that matter alone, as it likely has little to do with helping Remus here. Dumbledore said softly, but firmly. Nick was a bit disappointed, but quickly recovered. With this, I merely need some data from an animagus to compare with what I have before I can start working out a prototype enchantment, he said honestly. 339. Chapter 339. Lupin was quite shocked to hear this, but Dumbledore was not, since he understood that the depth of information Nick shared alone had plenty of workable points for fixing the magic. He knew the exact way the curse affected Lupin, as well as the energy that fueled the magic. He even knew roughly how the curse was originally created and how to potentially strip it away from someone. With all of this information at his fingertips, it would honestly be more surprising if he wasn't close to being able to create a prototype enchantment. With all of that said, though Dumbledore also recognized that this was also a play to get more information on Animagi magic for his own gains. That was perfectly fine in his opinion, as he had never intended for Nick to work without any self-benefit in this matter. The boy, for all of his genius, was very profit-driven and had only recently started to focus on helping others as well. I'm sure Sirius would be more than happy to help if we asked him, so long as we tell him what it's for, Lupin said, eagerly volunteering his friend. Nick said it didn't matter at all who the animagus was, so Sirius would work fine before they left, after sending a letter to the man via Fox. I should finish up my gifts for Christmas, since it is merely a waiting game at this point, Nick thought as he returned to the workshop. For Flitwick, it was a simply matter of giving him a generous amount of light material to study, as it clearly interested him greatly. For McGonagall, he instead created a quill out of one of Nazgul's shed feathers that he inlaid with mithril very carefully. The silver metal running down the center of the black, white, and golden feather gave it a sort of shine that appealed to the eyes greatly. He had quite a few of Nazgul's feathers, since as she grew, she had to replace her older, smaller ones with new, larger versions. For Snape, he forged a ladle that was enchanted to give detailed feedback to the person using it on the status of the potion. He had based this enchantment on both his understanding of potions and on his realm's analysis capabilities. Obviously, it was nowhere as impressive, but still good enough to be of some use to the man in his chosen field. For Hagrid, he ordered a pygmy drake from Aelop's Emporium that cost him a couple hundred galleons. Pygmy drakes were reptiles about the size of a house cat that were dragons in all regards except size and personality. Unlike dragons, they were not generally very aggressive or territorial unless trained to be such. At that point, they were really good at guarding an area since they tended to work in a group of 5 or more. Nick merely got the sort raised to be pets instead, since while Hagrid couldn't have an actual dragon, he would still love something like this. For Dumbledore, he simply got the man a dozen thick woolen socks just for the hell of it. Sirius, on the other hand, got a custom-made bracelet that was enchanted to get rid of the lingering effects of his long-term exposure to Dementors, as well as strengthen his body back to healthy levels. Even now, months after he had been released, the man was nowhere near recovered from the decade of malnutrition, spiritual rot, and illness. This gift would let him quickly reach full strength and even return to active combat against the Death Eaters that will no doubt be a problem soon. Finally done. Nick thought after he finished the bracelet that was the last gift he needed to prepare. Checking the time, he saw that it was only 6:32 and decided to go join the other students at dinner. His appearance in the Great Hall was met with a mix of jealousy and surprise as word had spread throughout the student body of his exemption from classes by this point. The less intelligent or short-sighted of the students were jealous and thought it unfair. The others, though, had figured out that he had simply traded one for of study and work for another, as he was much more tired-looking and absent-minded when he was seen now. His friends in Gryffindor were supportive of him and made no mention of his exemption, as he had told them the terms of it, and they knew he was truly working his hardest. Regardless of all else, they saw him smelt no less than 400 blank iron rings a day that he turned into rings of protection in varying amounts. 340. Chapter 340. Nick turned in for the night after dinner, as he was quite tired mentally after the past few days' activities. The next 3 days were fairly quiet, as he spent the entire time enchanting the ring blanks he smelted to try and work his way through the large number of protection rings he needed to finish for his mission. There was a bonus to this sort of mindless, repetitive actions, though, as he was quickly growing more and more capable of enchanting more and more rings at once with this specific enchantment. At first it was 20 per reserve, but by the end of the 3rd day, he could barely stretch it to 30, putting his total at 360 per day. This lowered the amount of time it would take to complete the mission to about 3 years based on the rough math. He figured that by the end of next year he might finish up if he continued to improve at his current rate, maybe even soon if he was lucky. On the 4th day, though, he received a visitor in the form of one Sirius Black who wanted almost desperately to be of help to his friend. Thanks to the data Nick received from his transformation to and from his animal form, Nick identified the parts of the curse he needed to target for correction, and which ones served a different purpose. Sirius was allowed to stay on for the rest of the week as an assistant teacher for Lupin, during which time he spent as much time as possible with Harry. Nick, on the other hand, had locked himself away within the workshop over this time, drafting, scrapping, and restarting his creation of an enchantment for Lupin's ring. The holiday break came without him even knowing, as he poured his undivided attention into this project, only stopping to eat, drink, and use the restroom as needed. "You should take a day off, child. You are running yourself ragged like this," Celebrimber said, concerned at the pace Nick was holding. He wasn't alone in his concern either, as Helena, Dusk, and the professors were all worried about him burning out. Nick also knew that this was unhealthy, but this matter needed to be done as soon as possible, as the next full moon was a mere 3 weeks away. He could relax once the mission was finished, but for now, he felt that only his maximum effort would suffice, as no mistakes could be made. Still, he relented and took an entire day of nothing but relaxation and recovery. It's amazing to see the sort of progress you can make if you take a moment to distress. He thought, looking at the newest enchantment design he had created in his realm. By itself, it appeared disharmonious and incomplete, which was because it was. That was the unique thing about this enchantment. Its incompleteness was what made it work to complete the curse and turn it into a blessing. This was the reason he wanted to get it done before the next full moon, as it was only at that time that its full effects could be seen. He didn't make some sort of patch for the curse that masked the problems it had. No, what he made was a sort of magical organ transplant type thing. On the night of the full moon, when the lunar energy blankets the world, and the curse draws it into Lupin, the enchantment will creep into his body at that moment, and place itself over the broken parts that need fixing. The transformation will be excruciating for Lupin, but once the enchantment successfully suppresses the broken parts of the curse, and its parts meld with the rest of the magic, a dramatic change shall commence. No longer will the cells turn cancerous and destructive, but rather cancerous in a positive, reinforcing manner, with a set limit to prevent them from turning dangerous. The life force will grow more powerful and harmonious as the wrong parts no longer are there, having been replaced by the good ones. The final touch Nick added, though, was that after this first transformation, the pain will no longer exist for Lupin, and in fact, given enough time, the original curse's broken parts will be overwritten entirely. This means that not only will Lupin be able to freely control his transformation like a true animagus, but he will not even need the enchantment anymore after a certain amount of time. The best part in Nick's opinion, though, was that he corrected the disproportional form of the body after transformation into a powerful and perfect hybrid of wolf and man. Of course, this all hinges on the next full moon going perfectly after this ring is put on. Nick thought seriously. 341. Chapter 341. Ring, Lupi Venari grade. Mythical abilities. Auto-sizing, lycanthropy blend, life force correction, control mythical ability. Blessing of the moon. Under the light of the full moon, the wearer is more powerful in their transformed state. Description. A grand creation made to repair and replace all that was broken or wrong with the magic of lycanthropy, and builds upon that foundation to turn it into a blessing instead. System appraisal. A complex ring that will change history and carve its name in myth created by an established ring smith. Analyzing the silver ring in the shape of a howling wolf head, Nick was surprised to see that it was a mythical grade ring. He hadn't even noticed that he had added a transcendent ability to the enchantment, which confused him for a moment until he figured it out. It was an accident on his part, in truth, as he made the enchantment to use the moon's effect to take root in Lupin's body and act on the curse. This integral feature didn't vanish when the enchantment replaced the curse's parts, but rather the moon's light now causes the person wearing the ring to get a buff in the points that the enchantment held sway over. A happy accident, to be sure, but an unintended one none the less that Nick didn't feel he could take pride in as a result. I can now proudly say that you have reached my own level of skill, so congratulations are due, Celebrimber said with a smile after reading the results of the analysis alongside Nick. Having been bound to the system, he was able to see it just fine, and as a result was now certain that Nick had almost fully digested the sum of his inheritance. Perhaps he couldn't weave whole runic sentences into his works, yet but that was due to power and age instead of pure skill. Nick grinned widely at this, as he knew that this was right, and that wherever he takes the crafting style after this will be by his own work and effort. Now I just need to see the fruit of my labor on the next full moon, he said with a smile, and finally relaxed. It was a serious weight off of his mind, as he finally had some room to take it easy for a while. Perhaps he still needed to work on the rings of protection, but he had always thought of that as an unpressing concern. After all, he had years for that task, while the matter of Lupin needed to be at the forefront of his effort. Checking the time, he found that it was only around 4 in the afternoon and left his workshop. He felt the cold chill of the air and the snowy landscape outside the windows as he walked towards the Dada office that Lupin was likely in. The hallways were nearly empty, as most of the student population had left for the holidays. This included all of his friends, including Harry, who was now living with Sirius in the Black ancestral home after it had been fixed up and cleaned. It was a strange thing, according to Harry, as he had never known what it was like to have a caring family until now. Nick was happy for his friend, and honestly hoped he wouldn't get dragged into the upcoming mess Grindelwald was going to release on the world. It didn't take Nick long to reach the office without any foot traffic obstructing his way. Lupin was sitting on an armchair at the corner of the room reading a book when Nick entered. The man marked his page and set the book on the arm table next to him after seeing who was visiting him. "What can I do for you today, Nick?" he asked politely. Nick grinned and tossed the wolf ring to him. Lupin caught the ring and looked at it with wide eyes, as he had a suspicion as to what it was, but was afraid to ask and risk disappointment. "That ring is the second best one I have ever made, and come the next full moon should change your life for the better," Nick said honestly with no small amount of pride. Lupin's eyes watered when he heard this, such a small thing, and yet. He spoke softly and stared at the ring as if trying to memorize its every detail through teary eyes. Nick couldn't really blame him all that much, as he had suffered that curse for so long, and now he held the cure in his hands. Perhaps it wasn't a true cure in that it didn't strip the curse from him, but it couldn't even be considered a curse anymore thanks to the ring, but a blessing. 342. Chapter 342. Lupin wiped his eyes and calmed himself. "I am sorry for showing you such an unsightly state. You cannot possibly even begin to imagine what this means to me," he said sincerely. Nick just chuckled. "I'm afraid you have celebrated a tad early. Your next transformation is going to be especially painful as the enchantment takes hold. After that, though, the transformation will be little different than that of an animagus," he said honestly. Lupin didn't look bothered by this, though. "It has always been painful, so it shouldn't make much difference," he said, not grasping the sort of pain Nick was actually referring to. "I'm afraid you are not understanding me clearly, so let me give you a comparison to help. What you will be experiencing will likely be comparable to being hit with the Cruciatus curse. It might even drive you mad if you take it lightly," Nick said seriously. Lupin lost most of his enthusiasm at that knowledge, but was determined to shake off the shackles of his curse, even if it meant suffering greatly. He put the ring on his pointer finger, where it shrank down to fit perfectly. "I'll take my chances, but thank you for the warning," he said with a smile. Nick left after that, since he had done what he came here for, and thus had no reason to stay. From the office, he went outside and took out his broom so he could relax a bit in the sky. His broom was nothing like it was when he first got it, however, as he had long decoded the runes and upgraded it to a stupid degree. Massively increased speed, durability, control, as well as reduced air resistance made it so that for those watching, he seemed to vanish from his spot on the ground the moment he mounted the broom. The loud crack they heard after that, and the shockwave that followed it, told a very different story, however. Nick had broken the sound barrier the moment he took off, and was already high in the sky in mere seconds. The entire castle heard the sound barrier break, and it confused many as to what exactly was going on. A few of the professors, however, that were more knowledgeable figured out what had occurred and had wry smiles. They couldn't exactly say that it was a broom reaching nearly unheard of speeds, as that would cause even more problems. The only reason it was nearly unheard of instead of just plain unheard of was that there was in fact a type of broom created a few decades prior capable of breaking the sound barrier. Speed had never been an issue for broom makers. No, the real problem came in the form of wind pressure and control. At such high speeds, it became difficult to have any fine control over the broom, thus relegating that type of broom to cross-continental travel alone. Nick's broom, however, did not have that problem, as his reaction speed was superhuman, thanks to the ritual of reflex he went through. This meant that giving the broom hair trigger sensitivity wasn't detrimental like it would be for normal people. Add on the wind resistance protection, and Nick was zipping through the sky at stupid fast speeds, having a good old time. There was a couple of people on the Quidditch teams that noticed how easy it was for him to fly at such a speed, and became very interested in his broom. It should be known that speed was a very important factor in the game, as it made winning much easier. This actually caused a rather funny scene as they approached Nick after he landed, and asked about the broom. He decided to play a small prank on them and didn't explain why he alone was capable of using it, and let one of them borrow it for a test flight. Both that person and the broom had to be saved from crashing into the ground at Mark 1. The others didn't believe that it was so difficult to handle despite the person's testimony, and tried it out themselves before also needing to be saved from a gruesome end. Nobody showed any interest in the broom after that, as they all valued not dying needless deaths. Nick knew that it wasn't impossible to learn how to fly like that, for a normal person, considering fighter pilots did so in considerably larger and more complex machines. The key difference, however, was that it required a lot of training to do, and even then one mistake, and that fighter jet will hit the ground or worse, another plane. Sure, he could probably start his own broom company with his knowledge, but he didn't see much point. 343. Chapter 343. Time blurred by for Nick after that, until he eventually found himself with a pile of presents at the foot of his bed on Christmas Day. He had gifts of all shapes and sizes waiting for him when he woke up, and was slightly surprised at the number. There was of course gifts from his friends that numbered 8, since the twins were included in that group. Then there was a gift from Hagrid, Lupin, Sirius, McGonagall, Flitwick, Dumbledore, and even Snape. These gifts also weren't surprising at all to receive for Nick, as he figured he would receive something from them. No, the surprise came from 4 people he had simply not expected to get a gift from at all due to his limited interaction with them. Madame Maxime, Ollivander, Mr. Crumont, and Nicholas Flamel all sent him gifts. His curiosity got the best of him, and he ignored the normal gifts in favor of opening these first. From Madame Maxime, there was a card addressed to him that explained why he had received a gift from her. It was simply because she loved the newest line of fashion that had been created based on Nazgul, and wanted to give him a piece of it to show her appreciation. Her gift was an open-chested trench coat with long sides and raised collar that was primarily black with cream and gold undertones and seams. On either side of the chest was 2 brilliant and detailed golden eyes with reptilian slit pupils. Despite its intimidating color choice and style, the coat still managed to capture Nazgul's friendliness and positivity. Nick loved it. Ollivander, on the other hand, didn't send a card or anything, but rather a copy of a book on veritology. It was a simply but good gift that showed the value he placed on guiding future craftsmen in the art. From Mr. Crumont, he received a card telling him how much the old man enjoyed having him as a guest when he so rarely received them. The gift was twofold, in fact, as it contained a very rare tome on magical crafting, as well as a sealed container with the first dish Nick had ordered from the restaurant. The preservative charms were still working perfectly, as when Nick opened the container, the food was still hot and fresh, as if it was served not moments before. Nicholas Flamel, on the other hand, sent Nick a book on the basic knowledge he was likely missing from creating his own crafting style. Most of it was things he had already patched after he received the great alchemist's advice previously, but there were several points that were not covered in any texts he had browsed for that, a wonderful gift. From his friends, the gifts were much more personal in nature. Harry sent him some feather grooming kit with a tag attached teasing him for his beast companions. Ron sent a small wooden bird that he had secretly carved out of a piece of wood. Hermione sent some of his favorite candy in the form of chocolate frogs of various flavors. Daphne sent him a chunk of star metal with a tag that explained how he had complained about his lack of stock in it. Tracy, much like Hermione, sent chocolate frogs, though of the normal variety this time. Luna sent a copy of the Tales of Beedle the Bard that she bookmarked her favorite stories in. This made him chuckle, as he had long memorized this book of stories to see if it was only the 3 brothers' tale with some accuracy, or if there were others as well. From Hagrid, he got a container of the man's walnut fudge, which was practically guaranteed cavities. Flitwick a book on rare metals, McGonagall a fancy new golden inkwell, Snape sent a set of mind-clearing potions, and Dumbledore sent a strange metal box that was positively humming with mana. It was odd, since it appeared to be made from 6 different types of material, and yet didn't have a single seam anywhere on it. One side was bone, one was iron, one was wood, one was quartz, one was ice, and the last one was skin, all of which were solid without any give. Lupin and Sirius's gifts were more personal in nature, as one of them sent Nick a valuable set of material, while the other a thick stack of old books. Lupin sent the materials, and Sirius sent the books directly from the Black family library. All in all, Nick would say he had a good morning on this Christmas day. The day was quiet and relaxing as the population of the school got into the festive spirit. 344. Chapter 344. It wasn't all fun times for Nick, though, as he and Nazgul both hit a growth spurt at this point and started to grow. For Nick, it was normal growth due to him being 12 and officially hitting puberty. For a human, this was a little late, but for an elf it was fairly standard due to their long lifespans allowing for a longer growth period. In Nazgul's case, however, it was because she had eaten quite a few souls from small creatures since the last time she grew, and now had enough energy stored to get bigger. She did too, as by the time the holiday break was over she was slightly smaller than a horse in size, and simply didn't fit in most parts of the castle anymore. At least not without making those areas a bit crowded. The hallways were large, but even those were only so wide, and she took up roughly half of them. Doorways were entirely impossible to fit through for her now, much to her great distress. Nick was unfortunately left with little choice, but to either keep her in the realm all the time or have her stay out of the castle entirely. Hitting puberty as an elf did something rather surprising for Nick's mana reserves that he hadn't expected. See, for a while now, his mana growth had slowed to a crawl, which was to be expected considering he had way more mana than a 12-year-old had any business with at his disposal. As a result, his growth had slowed down to allow his body to acclimate to the power within it. Hitting puberty, however, had accelerated his growth rate again, though not by as fast as before. Instead, he was right beneath Harry's growth. This was much more acceptable than his previous speed, considering the threats he had to actively prepare for. Still, on New Year's Day, he wasn't thinking about any of that, as he stood outside the castle waiting for his friends to arrive. When Nick spotted Hermione and the other girls leaving a carriage, he smiled and waved at them. They all smiled and walked over welcome back. He said happily as they arrived before him. "That book on enchantments was a huge help with my studies over the holidays. Thank you, Nick," Hermione said excitedly. "Same here," Daphne added with a smile without losing her composure. "Your gift got me in trouble with my father. He said metal working is not a thing a proper lady should do. Can you believe that?" Tracy complained, but it was still clear that she actually liked her gift. Crafting knows no gender, and any craftsman worthy of the name will say the same. Nick said reassuringly. "Yeah, I know, but it still sucks that my father doesn't agree," Tracy said with a sigh. "I take it you also like your gift, Luna," Nick said with a raised eyebrow at the girl who had changed her hair to a rainbow color. "Umu, the rack spurts dance funny around it," she said with a dopey smile. Nick chuckled at that answer. "That's just because of how I made it. Otherwise, it isn't all that special," he said honestly. "Maybe not to you, but I like it," Luna said, and Nick smiled. "I'm surprised that Harry and Ron aren't with you all. Hopefully, they didn't try and take a flying car to school this time," Nick said jokingly. Hermione grimaced at the mention of that incident. "Thank Merlin not. We couldn't all fit into a carriage, so they had to get in a different one is all," she explained with an exasperated expression. "Ah, speak of the devil, here they are," Nick said as the next carriage stopped, and its door opened to reveal Harry and Ron all bundled up to resist the weather. "Bloody hell, you wouldn't believe the looks I got from my family when they saw your gift, Nick," Ron complained immediately after the boys joined up with the group. "Why, I'd never thought I'd see the day my little Ronnie would be excited to get a book. That's what my mum said when she saw it before she forced me to spill it and tell them about me learning to make wands. It was dreadful," he continued complaining. "Looks like a classic case of suffering from success to me." Nick joked, and everyone else in the group smirked except Ron. "Don't you joke around about this. I never heard the end of it the rest of the holiday and felt like dying in embarrassment," Ron said with a small smirk. "How about you, Harry? What did you think of your gift?" Nick asked the only person who hadn't spoken yet. "It's brilliant. You should have seen how jealous Sirius was when I pulled it out of the sheath," Harry said with a wide smile. 345. Chapter 345. "Oh, right. Sirius wanted me to thank you for his present, says he was starting to get sick of potions anyways. Harry added, and Nick chuckled. I assumed as much. He didn't strike me as the type to enjoy sitting in place for very long, even if it was for his own good. He said honestly. Harry nodded. He's great, and all but rather restless after being cooped up for so long to recover. He said with a sigh. He still has nightmares about that place, you know. I've heard him crying in his sleep sometimes. He said softly. Can't say I blame him from what I know of that cursed place. Purposeful starvation and constant exposure to the happiness-eating monsters that are dementors that make you relive your worst memories over and over will take its toll on even the strongest of wills. Nick said with a disgusted expression. Despite considering themselves better than Muggles, the wizards' version of prison was considerably more inhumane in the Isles than the Muggle prisons. The group got quiet at this, as it was an ugly truth that no one liked looking at. You are in for a treat, though, when you see Nazgul. She's bigger than before. Nick said, breaking up the gloomy atmosphere. How much bigger? Hermione asked, suspicious of his smirk. Nick didn't answer, but merely whistled loudly, which also drew the attention of the other students arriving. From out of the forbidden forest, with a giant spider leg sticking out of her mouth, flew Nazgul. Please tell me that thing in her mouth isn't what I think it is. Ron said, pale and shuddering at the thought. Okay, I nod. Nick teased, and everyone other than Ron laughed. There was quite a few oohs and ahs when Nazgul landed on the ground not far from the group. In the time it took her to fly over, she finished eating her snack and had gotten excited after seeing the group. She had developed a taste for the giant spiders in the forest after one of them attacked the young unicorn that was friends with her, and she killed it. Nick was fairly certain that she got that food preference from the basilisk that had clear influence on her form before she was born. Still other than Hagrid, who insisted that she not eat Aragog, the rest of the man, eating spiders were fair game. As much as the half-giant disliked the idea of magical creatures getting hurt, he also understood how predator and prey worked, and Nazgul was clearly the predator of the acromantulas. It was much the same way he would turn a blind eye to a fox killing a rabbit if he came across it. Bloody hell, she's huge, Ron exclaimed when Nazgul walked up. The rest of the group agreed with him as they looked at her in awe. My theory is that by the time she's fully grown, she'll be about the size of a dragon and way more dangerous to boot, Nick said while scratching Nazgul under her jaw where she liked it. The large creature's eyes narrowed in enjoyment at his ministrations and swished her tail happily behind her. Luna was the first of the group to get over her new size and come shower the large beast in affection. This helped the rest realize that she was still the same Nazgul as always and come pet her. Things were peaceful for the next week as Nick mostly relaxed, while spending most of his time cranking out rings of protection as well as honing his spell casting for the higher years curriculum. This changed on the 8th of January, which was the next full moon in which he went with Lupin, Dumbledore, and Sirius, surprisingly enough, to the Shrieking Shack. To reiterate, this is going to look like a horror show, but nobody make any moves to help him, or you could make it so much worse, Nick warned sternly. Both Sirius and Dumbledore nodded seriously as they both understood that the road to hell was paved with good intentions. Other than that, there shouldn't be any complications, so no need to be anxious. Nick added reassuringly, I do wonder what the result of this enchantment of yours will be. You've been rather silent on the matter so far, Dumbledore said curiously. Despite not knowing exactly how the enchantment worked, the old goat had still looked it over, and was surprised to see that it was incomplete when taken from Lupin. Nick had to explain this to him, but afterwards Dumbledore was impressed at the enchantment, as the way it worked was ingenious. Using an aspect of the curse to cause the changes to be snuck into the curse's foundation was a tricky and interesting idea. 346. Chapter 346. Despite this, Dumbledore was a little bitter, since this method of breaking a curse would only work for something like lycanthropy that was powered by an outside source. Most curses instead fed on the magical energy or life force of the victims, making this method useless to deal with them. Out of everyone in the room, though, Lupin was the most nervous, as he was the one that needed to deal with the pain soon. He rubbed his thumb over the ring on his finger to try and calm himself as he had recently gotten into the habit of doing. They remained silent after that as Nick sat down on a chair he conjured to wait while meditating. Once 7:30 rolled around, and the influence of the sun was waning to be replaced by the moon's, Lupin clutched his chest tightly and fell over. Nick opened his eyes and watched the beginning of this transformation carefully. He was also holding his wand in case an unforeseen problem happens. All of his simulations in the realms stated that nothing should, but those didn't account for outside factors interfering. Lupin writhed on the ground in agony as his eyes, ears, and nose bled when the veins burst in them. After that, his bones began to crack and reform all over his body, alongside his muscles and inner layer of skin. There was only a whistling sound coming from Lupin, as he couldn't even scream from the pain he was feeling. The tips of his fingers grew long, sharp Lupin claws, while his teeth and facial bones elongated alongside his ears. It was a gruesome display to witness, but Nick knew it was necessary, as this was a process of the enchantment overriding the curse's parts. The final step, though, that spoke of the success of this transformation was when the top layer of Lupin's skin tore and fell off, revealing thick, light brown hair on his entire body. Hiss! Hew! The sound of powerful lungs taking in air and releasing it filled the room, while all three of the spectating wizards waited with bated breath for the owner of these breaths to show some sign of awareness. Lupin lifted his right arm and pushed himself up slowly and uneasily until he could get his wolf-like feet under him. It was only at this point that he opened his now dark brown eyes to take a look at himself. As the moon's energy poured into him, Lupin couldn't help but notice that he felt good, yes, good. Not ill or weak or wrong, but good. He was in awe of it all and raised a claw-tipped arm to inspect, and was surprised at the power he felt coursing through him. His senses were sharp, sharper than ever in fact, as he could smell everything, and his hearing picked up a steady heartbeat and two anxious ones. His vision was perfect, and even seemed to be made for the darkness, as he saw everything as if the sun was still up. "You still in there, mate?" Sirius asked worriedly, which caused Lupin to look at him and hold up a clawed thumb. Both Dumbledore and Sirius relaxed at that point and sighed in relief before walking over to look at Lupin's new form closer. Incredible, an addition 2 feet of height from your transformed legs, and unlike your previous transformations, you appear to be in extraordinary condition. Not a single piece of discoloration or disproportional feature on your entire body, Dumbledore said after looking him over carefully. "Now that you are done showing off, turn back. It should be easy to do now," Nick said without having gotten up from his chair at all. "What do you mean?" Sirius asked, confused. "I specifically made that enchantment to give him full control over his transformation after he achieved this form, so he should have the ability to shift back to his human form like any other animagus," Nick explained calmly. Sirius looked at Lupin, but the werewolf looked reluctant, and Nick chuckled since he had an idea why. "It's intoxicating, the power and senses you now have access to, that is," he said, and Lupin looked away in embarrassment. "You can have them whenever you want, like any animagus, so change back already," Nick said calmly, and Lupin nodded. He closed his eyes, and immediately his body began to shrink and morph back into its human shape. Much like a normal animagus transformation, it was painless and resembled transfiguration spells greatly. Just before he returned to human form, the extra hair all over his body was shed off and fell into a pile at his feet. "And that, gentleman, is history being made," Nick said with a smirk. 347. Chapter 347. The other three wizards couldn't help but finding themselves agreeing with Nick's statement, as this couldn't be anything but a historic event. For the first time since lycanthropy reared its ugly head, there was someone who could fully control it, as though it were an animagus transformation. Should word about this get out, it would resound throughout the world and cause a huge commotion. Werewolves were generally considered pests or undesirables by wizarding society, precisely because of the inability to control themselves after transforming. If that was not the case, however, many seeking power would flock to get infected for the benefits it would give them. There is one tiny side effect you would need to worry about, though: longevity. The curse from before lowered your lifespan greatly because of the damage it did to your body per transformation, and this new state instead does precisely the opposite, in that it bolsters it considerably. I would not be surprised to see you in a couple hundred years looking like the actual old man here," Nick said with a chuckle. "If that is true, then it truly does seem as though you have indeed done as you said and turned the curse into a blessing," Dumbledore said with a twinkle in his eyes and smile. Nick excused himself after that, since he had no more reason to stay, and he had a mission to collect. No one tried to stop him, as all of them minus Sirius were aware of how busy he was, and that what came next did not concern him. Nick went straight for the castle, and despite Filch seeing him, the old keeper of the castle ignored him, as all the staff had been told of Nick's freedom to roam the castle regardless of time. It certainly helped that Nick made a point to stay on the old man's good side with a magical artifact that didn't need flowing magic to use. It was a simple ring that allowed Filch to use a weak form of telekinesis, but was a prized treasure in the squib's eyes. Filch's status as a squib was not very well hidden, as it was one of the reasons the man seemed to hate the students of the school. Without being able to cast magic, but still having it, made the man bitter from years of jealousy. That was the truth about squibs that Nick had long since figured out thanks to his senses. They were a result of generations of inbreeding and atrophied magic circuits, creating a person with a magical core, but no open pathways for the magic to flow. What the ring did was connect directly to Filch's magical core to fuel his use of telekinesis. Thanks to this easy gift on Nick's part, Filch treated him much more politely than other students. Nick went straight to the workshop before going into the realm to accept his rewards for the mission. Nick had completed the first and third objectives of the quest, but the second one was going to be ignored for his own safety. Publicizing that he had not only basically cured Lupin, but had also turned the curse into a blessing, was a fast way to paint a massive target on his back by every werewolf on the planet. Good or bad, every werewolf on the planet would be after him, and that didn't even include the people who wouldn't want to see werewolves truly empowered in this manner, which is to say a lot of people across the globe. While he was curious about the contents of this book that would have been his reward, he was more than happy avoiding it, and the trouble of completing that objective, since the best prize was already his. 3-item tickets manifested in the realm, but he ignored them to focus on the other item that had appeared instead, a Daedra heart. The hearts of Daedra weren't strictly for moving blood through their bodies, but rather were directly tied to their immortal essence. This was why Daedric equipment was considered alive to a degree, as it was in fact alive, thanks to the essence of the Daedra trapped within it. Once the equipment was abandoned or destroyed, the essence was released, and that Daedra could then reform in the waters of oblivion. What Nick wanted the heart for, however, wasn't a piece of equipment, but rather a sacrifice to empower himself. This was, of course, part of his plan, involving the ritual of nature to be performed this upcoming Beltane that will increase his magical power, based on the power of the creature parts he sacrificed. So far he had the eyes of a 1,000-year-old basilisk, the heart of a Daedra, and the heart of an extinct species of dragon from Slytherin's horde, which meant he only needed 3 more parts to have all he needed. 348. Chapter 348. The ritual specified that he could use parts from no more than 6 creatures, and so he planned to use the best possible ingredients for it. The 3 he currently had were all at minimum XXXXX class dangerous things, with the Daedra heart being a bit iffy in its category. See, the description of the heart didn't say which sort of Daedra it came from, so it was entirely possible it was the heart of a peon-level Daedra. Even then, though, Daedra were pretty much all apex existences due to their near-immortal natures. It was certainly possible to kill a Daedra, but to do so required dispersing their essence entirely, which was difficult to say the least. The problem Nick had at the moment was that there was not any powerful creature parts that he could get his hands on that weren't either highly illegal or kept by old families as treasures. He could use acromantula parts, since they were fairly powerful creatures, but the thought seemed wrong to him, cheap almost. With a colony of the things available to be hunted, he could easily obtain what he wanted from them, but he wanted only the best for his ritual. He was briefly tempted by the Hydra heartstring within the staff, but immediately shook that thought from his head as foolishness. The staff was basically the perfect way to resurrect someone or heal a life-threatening injury, so destroying it for the heartstring would be the height of stupidity. Out of all the XXXXX class creatures left in the world, the only one that really caught his attention due to its nature was a lethofold. These creatures were immortal, just like dementors and poltergeists, and much the same were basically impossible to kill via conventional magics. Lethofolds at first glance appeared to be little more than dark cloak-like objects that were a bit too flowy. In truth, they were dark things that hunted by creeping around their victims when unaware and suffocating them to death before slowly dissolving the body and consuming it. They also exclusively hunted humans, making them contain on-site targets for wizard kind. Apparently, the creatures grow more powerful and larger the more they consume, with the largest known lethofold being nearly 20 feet long and needing a team of over 50 powerful wizards to contain it, of which 20 died in the process. Thanks to the soul shot arrows Nick had, he could actually kill the things, but this came with the problem of finding one worth killing. The largest one was contained within a large, nigh impenetrable goblin, forged box positively covered in seals within the Ministry of Magic's Forgotten Halls. The Forgotten Halls were not referring to a place that had been forgotten, but rather about the nature of the things stored there. The phrase, lock it, throw away the key, and forget it existed, summed up the way the Ministry, and by extension, wizarding community treated things stored here. The Forgotten Halls were the place things were sent to be purposefully lost to history and hopefully never found again. Nick wouldn't have even known about the existence of the place had it not been for the brief mention of it in one of the Forbidden Section's books. Darty, Nick called out after leaving the realm with the 3-item tickets. With a loud pop, the house elf appeared before him, eager to serve. How can this one serve the great master? Darty asked eagerly. Find a lethofold and kill it with these before bringing whatever is left afterwards to me, assuming there is anything left, Nick commanded while handing over a dozen soul-shot arrows. The elf took the arrows and vanished, eager to do as he had commanded regardless of how dangerous the task seemed. That was simply the way house elves were, so Nick didn't mind at all and considered the matter of the 4th creature part finished for now. This left him with the last 2 parts needed for the ritual that was rapidly approaching. He sighed before accepting that an acromantula part was going to be the 5th ingredient. If he could freely advertise that he needed rare and powerful creature parts, with the rarer and more powerful the better, then he wouldn't need to do this. The reality of the matter, however, was that any advertisement like that is asking the Ministry to bust down his door and throw him in Azkaban for illegal magic use. As a result, Nick could only resolve himself to getting slightly less than optimal results, as this was the last year he could perform the ritual due to the age restriction on it. 349. Chapter 349. Ideally, Nick wanted a part from a North American horned water serpent, but not only were they highly illegal to hunt, but were the house animal of one of the Ilvermorny houses. Considering that that was the only magical school in North America, being even remotely related to the hunting of the things was a fast way to get on the whole population's bad side. It also didn't help that the huge serpents also had powerful divination abilities that made it impossible to hunt them unless they allow it. At that point, though, it becomes a matter of hoping that whatever they saw in the future was solved by their sacrifice, or you were in for a rough time. That reminded Nick, for whatever reason, of the magical family that existed over in the United States that was the descendants of Slytherin, the Sayre. It was rather funny, in a way, that the only remaining members of Slytherin's bloodline in the world had entirely abandoned the man's institution and country. In fact, unlike the Gaunts, the Sayre were very noble, as they truly sought the betterment of wizards, both muggle-born and pureblood alike. I should probably get to work on that soul-devouring spell for Harry now that he has that dagger suppressing the soul shard. Nick thought offhandedly as he pondered how to get what he needed for the ritual. There was a very long list of magical creatures to choose from, and while most were illegal, there were a few that he might be able to get his hands on in short order. I suppose I need to take a trip to the black market in Nocturne Alley to test my luck, he decided finally before pulling out a textbook to study. He wasn't on a very tight deadline anymore, and thus felt it a good idea to focus on increasing his magical skill to the 7th year at minimum as fast as possible. Thankfully, he could mostly ignore potions, herbology, history, and transfiguration, since he was either very good at those subjects, or they were mostly just memorization subjects. This left him with Dada, charms, astrology, and his extra classes, which in his case is arithmancy, care of magical beasts and runes. Runes he had mostly covered, but was filling in his basic knowledge that he sort of skipped thanks to his ability. Arithmancy and care of magical beasts, there were absolute slogs to go through, because one was mind-meltingly complex, while the other required a lot of memorization, as well as a good affinity for magical creatures. The first topic required time to figure out, while the second required experience, which was also a form of time. Nick was sort of in a hurry to improve, though, so those two subjects were mostly on the back burner for the moment. Learning the information in his textbooks on charms and Dada was a matter of memorization, but actually mastering the information was an entirely different matter. It should be understood that the complexity and power of the magics taught in the later years grew with each year. Nick, as a result, thought that the Wizarding Society was really pathetic, as they accepted a mere surface-level understanding in order to pass with a good grade. As a result of this, once the students left that information behind, they tended to forget it entirely, which means they were all usually failures when they graduated. Thankfully, there was enough people graduating that truly understood the information to keep the society afloat, but it was without any doubt slowly and painfully decaying from all the rest, dragging those few down with them. In a manner of speaking, the upcoming turmoil of Grindelwald's recovery of the world might just be the kick in the backside that wizarding kind needed to truly prosper. Many will die undoubtedly in the process, but the final result will be pretty worth it, all things considered. Nick was fairly certain that this was actually the reason none of the really powerful people are doing much to stop the man, save just going through the motions or hiding away. Anyways, Nick was currently up to the middle of the 5th year in terms of understanding the magic in the textbooks. This was actually quite good considering everything he has been busy with since getting his exemption. Thanks to that exemption, he actually had much more time to cover the textbooks, so even while splitting his time with other things, he has made good progress. He spent the next few days making rings of protection and pushing his skill ever forward while he waited for his house elf to return to him. 350. Chapter 350. While he waited for that, he took a few hours to visit the Forbidden Forest with Nazgul to hunt another acromantula. Much to his surprise, the territory of the giant monster spiders had actually shrunk rather than grown. It should be understood that the spiders basically had no natural predators in this forest, and it was only the efforts of the centaurs and unicorns that kept their spread at bay, but only just barely. Acromantulas bred 3 times a year in huge numbers each time, so it did not take much time at all for their numbers to swell to uncontrollable amounts if left without a natural predator. Due to the ever-increasing need for food, this created the spiders started to expand their territory further and further. That is until now, it seems, as Nazgul is diminishing their numbers rapidly if they have drawn back this much. Nick thought, seeing the clearly abandoned webbing, that the centaurs were starting to clear out. These same centaurs obviously saw him, but after seeing Nazgul with him, chose to keep whatever rude thoughts they had to themselves. She was a blessing as far as they were concerned, and was even friendly with the unicorns of the forest, so Nick couldn't be too bad if he was with her. As Nick traveled deeper into the area that used to belong to the giant spiders, he couldn't help but notice how lifeless it was. The webs that blocked out the sun beyond the treetops had caused all other plants other than moss to die off. This in turn led to the herbivorous creatures and the things that hunted them to vacate the area. Nothing lived in this part of the forest, which showed just how terrible the spiders were. Nick had no trouble seeing in the low light conditions of this area, thanks to his night vision, but for regular diurnal creatures, it would be perfect conditions to ambush prey for the stealthy monsters that lived here. Nick and Nazgul spotted one of the acromantulas before it spotted them from its hiding spot behind some roots of a tree. The thing had one of its legs held flat against the ground in front of it, as if mimicking a root, But that trick would only work if the prey didn't have night vision like Nick and Nazgul did. To them, it was pretty much just advertising its position like an idiot, which they were more than happy to take advantage of. Nick tapped his wand against the ground, and immediately a net of chains shot out of the ground and trapped the huge spider. "Here's!" The monster struggled violently against its sudden trappings, but Nick merely scoffed at it. The net he conjured was made out of tungsten, and not even a dragon had any hope of escaping it, much less this thing. Nazgul wasted no time at all pouncing on the struggling spider and ripping its soul out with her sharp talons. She ate the thing with relish, but left the still living body to Nick, since its parts were what he was in the forest for to begin with. He didn't need the legs, so he ripped them off and let her eat them while working to collect the venom before it dried, as well as the usable parts of the rest of it. A few other spiders showed up after likely catching the scent of the attack and coming to investigate, but Nick released Nazgul on them. If he had any doubt about how dangerous she was before seeing her hunt, then those doubts were gone now, as she barely needed any real effort to catch or kill the spiders. Petrify them with her stare, and harvesting at her leisure was her preferred method of hunting, but pure brute force was also an option if the spiders didn't make eye contact. Nick shuddered at the memory of her collapsing a spider's carapace under her talon like it was made of dried leaves. Still, he got a hefty amount of venom, as well as the part he needed by following her on a hunt, so he was satisfied with how it turned out. Once he returned to the castle, Nick handed over about half the venom to Snape, since he would be able to put it to good use. The man had a ghost of a smile on his face after receiving the rare and valuable liquid in such a large amount, as he easily figured out how Nick had obtained it. The colony of spiders living in the woods was a sort of open secret at the school, so he was very much aware of it, as well as made use of the spiders as well. Thanks to this, he was intimately familiar with how much venom a single spider gave, and could calculate the number needed to harvest the amount he received.